Hello, I am the Wizard of Tales, and I'm here to guide you today. I know this video is the perfect companion to help my dear dreamers relax and drift off to sleep. Before we dive into a world of calm and serenity, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, get cozy, take a deep breath, and let the magic of stories embrace you. The sun was setting on the horizon, dyeing the sky blood red over the imposing walls of Troy. 10 years had passed since the first Greek ships touched the city's shores, bringing with them an army thirsty for revenge and glory. Agamemnon, the mighty king of Mycenae, looked down on the fortified city from the top of a nearby hill, his face marked by scars and the weight of a decade of fruitless war. Next to him, Odysseus, known for his cunning and unique intelligence, gazed at the walls with a peculiar gleam in his eyes. His fingers drummed unconsciously on the hilt of his sword while his keen mind worked on yet another of his ingenious plans. The sea wind stirred his dark robes, bringing with it the smell of salt and the distant echo of the waves breaking on the beach. 10 years, my dear Odysseus, murmured Agamemnon, his voice laden with bitterness. 10 years of our lives wasted before these walls that seemed to laugh at our impotence. His eyes scanned the Greek camp spread across the plain below, where thousands of tents stretched as far as the eye could see. Troop morale was at its lowest, and whispers of giving up were beginning to spread like a plague among the soldiers. It was at this point that Odysseus, with an enigmatic smile, shared his idea. What if we could get the Trojans themselves to invite us in? His seemingly absurd proposal soon began to take shape in calculated words and precise gestures. The plan of the wooden horse was born there, under the bloody sky of Troy. Within the city walls, life was taking its tense but routine course. Priam, the venerable king of Troy, walked through the palace gardens accompanied by his daughter Cassandra, whose eyes always seemed to see beyond the present. The young prophetess carried with her the weight of a curse, the gift of predicting the future, but never being believed. "Father," she whispered, her eyes fixed on a distant point on the horizon, "I see shadows approaching our walls. They are not shadows of open warfare, but of deceit and betrayal." Priam, as always, only smiled indulgently, attributing his daughter's words to his fertile imagination. After all, the Greeks seemed as worn out as themselves after a decade of unresolved conflict. Hector, Troy's greatest warrior and Priam's eldest son, supervised the training of the troops in the main courtyard. His younger brother, Paris, whose abduction of Helen had triggered the whole war, watched from a distance, carrying the weight of the guilt he never openly admitted. Helen, for her part, remained in her quarters, her legendary beauty still able to dim the sun's glare. But her eyes bore the melancholy of someone who knew she was the cause of so much suffering. In the Greek camp, the construction of the horse began under the utmost secrecy. Epius, the most skilled carpenter among the Greeks, led a select team of craftsmen. The sound of hammers and saws echoed day and night, camouflaged by other camp noises so as not to arouse suspicion. The horse gradually took shape, a majestic structure as tall as 3 men, with enough space inside to house dozens of chosen warriors. Meanwhile, Odysseus personally selected the men who would take part in the riskiest mission of their lives. Each chosen warrior knew that the chances of success were as uncertain as the chances of survival. Among them were Diomedes, known for his boundless bravery, and Neoptolemus, son of the late Achilles, who was eager to prove his worth. As the plan developed, the tension in the Greek camp grew proportionally. Some veterans questioned the wisdom of the strategy, considering it a last act of desperation. Others, however, saw it as the only real hope of victory after years of failure. Laocoon, a Trojan priest devoted to Poseidon, began to have disturbing dreams. In his night visions, he saw Troy consumed by flames while a giant horse watched the destruction with empty eyes. His attempts to warn the city council were often met with skepticism, as were Cassandra's prophecies. The air was full of foreboding. Birds flew in strange formations over the city, and the sea seemed rougher than usual. The gods, high up on Mount Olympus, watched with renewed interest as events unfolded, some cheering for the Greeks, others for the Trojans, but all eager to see how that decade of conflict would come to an end. The construction of the horse progressed, and with it grew the expectation among the Greeks. Every detail was meticulously planned, from the exact moment to present the offering to the words that would be spoken to convince the Trojans of its authenticity. The structure was adorned with religious symbols and inscriptions dedicated to the goddess Athena, a calculated attempt to appeal to the Trojans' piety and religiosity. In the city, routine continued, but there was a growing unease in the air. Warriors on the walls reported strange movements in the Greek camp, although nothing that could be clearly identified as a threat. The population, exhausted from a war that seemed to have no end, longed for any sign that the conflict might be coming to an end. The horse was taking shape not only as a physical structure, but as a symbol of hope for the Greeks and, unknowingly, as a harbinger of destruction for the Trojans. Its shadow was already casting itself over the fate of both peoples, even before its conclusion, marking the beginning of a new phase in the decade-long war. As the sun rose over the Greek camp, the last details of the huge wooden horse were being finalized under the close supervision of Epius. The craftsman circled the structure with critical eyes, checking every joint, every fitting, ensuring that his creation was not only convincing in appearance, but also safe for the warriors who would soon hide inside. Odysseus gathered the warriors selected for the mission in his tent. The atmosphere was charged with tension as he explained the final details of the plan. Each man had to memorize his specific position on the horse and the exact moment of his action. A mistake, no matter how small, could cost not only their lives, but the entire operation. "Remember," said Odysseus, his voice low but firm, "when we are inside the walls of Troy, silence will be our greatest weapon. A whisper, a cough, any sound can give us away." His eyes traveled over the faces of the chosen men, finding in each of them the determination needed for the mission. Among the warriors, Diomedes organized small combat groups, assigning specific responsibilities for when the time came for action. Some would be responsible for eliminating the guards, others for opening the main gates, and a special group would head straight for the royal palace. In the camp, preparations began for the staging of the departure. Tents were dismantled for two purposes. Some would actually be taken to the ships, others would be hidden in the nearby hills, where the army would wait for the signal to return. The movement had to look genuine in the eyes of the Trojan lookouts. Inside Troy, Cassandra walked restlessly through the corridors of the palace. Her visions were becoming more intense and disturbing. In her dreams, she saw wooden horses crying tears of blood and heard the screams of her burning city. He tried to warn everyone he met, but as always, his words were met with polite smiles and looks of pity. Laocoon, sharing the same concerns, sought an audience with King Priam. The priest argued that the gods had sent him signs of imminent danger. "My king," he pleaded, "Poseidon stirs the waters with unusual fury. The sacrifices show dark omens. We must redouble our vigilance." Priam, although he respected the priest's devotion, was tired of living under the constant cloak of fear. "For 10 years we have kept our walls impregnable," he replied gently. "If the Greeks leave, it will be a blessing from the gods, not a curse." In the Greek camp, Agamemnon coordinated the logistics of the false retreat. Ships were prepared ostentatiously, loaded with supplies and equipment in full view of the Trojans. The smoke from the campfires gradually diminished, creating the illusion of an army in the process of abandoning the siege. Neoptolemus, eager to prove his worth, trained tirelessly with other chosen warriors, practicing silent movements and combat techniques in confined spaces. The young warrior carried not only the weight of his own ambition, but also the legacy of his father, Achilles. As the day progressed, an atmosphere of expectation hung over both sides of the conflict. The Greeks, knowing his plan, could hardly contain their anxiety. The Trojans, watching their enemies' movements from the walls, began to speculate on the meaning of his apparent retreat. Helena, from the top of her tower, watched the movement in the Greek camp with a mixture of contradictory emotions. Part of her longed for an end to the conflict that her beauty had sparked, while the other part feared the consequences of any change in the current stalemate. Paris, always by her side, tried to comfort her, although his own doubts consumed him. Odysseus' plan included an additional element of persuasion. Sinon, a Greek warrior known for his ability to manipulate, would be left behind. His task was to convince the Trojans of the authenticity of the offering and the departure of the Greeks. For days, Sinon rehearsed his story, perfecting every detail of his fictional narrative. When night fell over the camp, the chosen warriors performed silent rituals of preparation. Some sharpened their weapons one last time, others made discreet offerings to the gods. In the remaining tents, quiet conversations mingled with the sound of the sea, carrying promises of glory or omens of destruction. Ebu made the final adjustments to the mechanism that would allow the warriors to get off the horse. Every hinge was oiled, every lock tested with extreme care to ensure that it would work silently when the crucial moment arrived. The craftsman was aware that his work could determine the success or failure of the entire operation. The crescent moon illuminated the Greek camp as the final preparations were made. Tomorrow, the horse would be presented to the Trojans, and the fate of two nations would be sealed. There was a feeling in the air that the gods were watching intently, ready to witness the outcome of a war that had already lasted a whole decade. Dawn brought with it the moment that would define the fate of Troy. The huge wooden horse, gleaming in the first rays of the sun, was carefully transported to its strategic position in front of the city gates. Sinon, the man in charge of convincing the Trojans, waited nervously, mentally rehearsing his elaborate story. Inside the horse, the chosen Greek warriors stood in absolute silence, their hearts beating hard against their armor. Odysseus, strategically positioned next to the opening mechanism, transmitted orders through previously agreed gestures. The space was cramped and the heat gradually increased with the morning sun. On the walls of Troy, the watchmen observed the movement on the beaches with growing curiosity. The Greek ships, with their unrefined sails, looked ready to set sail. The sight of the huge horse provoked different reactions among the defenders. Some saw it as a sign of the Greeks' surrender, while others remained skeptical about the enemy's true intentions. Cassandra, in her chambers, was seized by a vision so intense that she fell to her knees. "Fire," she murmured repeatedly. "I see fire consuming our city." Her servants, used to her prophecies, tried to calm her down, but this time there was something different in her voice, an urgency that could not be ignored. Watching the horse on the wall, Laocoon felt a shiver run down his spine. Something about that monumental structure was arousing his most primitive instincts of danger. Determined to confirm his suspicions, he started down the steps of the wall, determined to examine the supposed offering more closely. Inside the horse, Diomedes controlled his breathing, trying to ignore the growing claustrophobia. Next to him, Neoptolemus could barely contain his youthful anxiety, but was constantly calmed by the stern looks of the more experienced warriors. The slightest noise could jeopardize the entire operation. Sinon, carrying out his part of the plan, approached the gates of Troy with his hands raised in surrender. His story was meticulously prepared. He would talk about his quarrels with Odysseus, how he had been abandoned, and the true nature of the horse as an offering to the goddess Athena to guarantee his safe return to Greece. King Priam, informed of the situation, summoned his council to an emergency meeting. Opinions were divided. Some advocated accepting the gift as a sign of peace, others argued for caution. Helen, present at the meeting, remained strangely silent, her eyes fixed on the horizon through the palace windows. Laocoon, arriving at the place where the horse was positioned, began to examine it carefully. His fingers roamed over the carved wood, looking for some sign that would confirm his suspicions. Inside the structure, the Greek warriors held their breath, tense at the proximity of the priest. The tension reached its peak when Laocoon, convinced of the danger, picked up a spear and hurled it at the horse's flank. The sound reverberated through the structure, causing moments of controlled panic among the hidden warriors. Luckily, The spear hit a specially reinforced part, producing only a hollow sound. "It's a trap," shouted Laocoon to the crowd that was beginning to form. "The Greeks would never offer us a gift of peace. We must destroy this structure immediately." His words were beginning to gain traction among some of those present, threatening the entire Greek plan. It was at this crucial moment that an unexpected event changed the course of events. Two huge serpents emerged from the sea, advancing rapidly towards Laocoon and his two sons who were standing nearby. The scene that followed was one of horror. The serpents enveloped the priest and his sons, silencing their warnings in a deadly embrace. The Trojans interpreted this event as a divine sign, a punishment from Athena for Laocoon's desecration of her offering. The fear of the gods overcame any remaining fears, and the decision to accept the horse within the walls was practically unanimous. Meanwhile, the Greek ships moved away from the coast, apparently abandoning the siege once and for all. In reality, they were only heading to a predetermined point, out of sight of the Trojans, where they would wait for the signal to return. The sun was beginning to set when the Trojans finally decided to bring the horse inside the walls. Part of the main gate had to be knocked down to accommodate the monumental structure, a detail that did not go unnoticed by the warriors hiding inside. The city was in a celebratory mood. Years of war seemed to have come to an end, and the horse was positioned in the main square as a symbol of Trojan victory. Wine flowed freely, music echoed through the streets, and even the most cautious began to relax their suspicions. Cassandra, in a last desperate effort, ran to the main square. "It is our destruction that we celebrate," she shouted across the festive crowd. "The belly of this horse carries our death." As always, his words were ignored, lost amid the sounds of festivity. Inside the horse, the Greek warriors endured the heat and discomfort, patiently waiting for the right moment. Odysseus kept an eye on the sounds outside, calculating the best moment to act. Night had to fall completely, and the city had to be plunged into the deep sleep of celebration. Night fell over Troy while the celebrations continued in the streets. The wine flowed abundantly, and the sounds of music and laughter echoed through the corners of the city. The warriors on horseback remained motionless, their muscles sore from the uncomfortable position, but their minds alert and focused on the mission. Odysseus watched the movement of the torches outside through a small window, calculating the perfect moment to act. Gradually, the voices began to diminish and the footsteps became slower, clear signs that exhaustion and drink were finally overcoming the partygoers. In the palace, Priam retired to his chambers, satisfied with the apparent end of the conflict. Helen, however, couldn't sleep. Something in the atmosphere that night deeply disturbed her. From the window of her chambers, she watched the silhouette of the horse against the starry sky, an unsettling presence in the familiar landscape of the city. Cassandra wandered the halls of the palace like a tormented spirit. Her visions were now so vivid that she could barely distinguish between reality and premonition. In every shadow, she saw Greek soldiers emerging. In every nocturnal noise, she heard the harbinger of imminent destruction. Inside his horse, Neoptolemus felt a drop of sweat trickle down his forehead. The young warrior fought the urge to move, remembering Odysseus' words about the importance of absolute silence. Next to him, Diomedes stood like a statue, his experience in battle translated into an enviable calm. The hours dragged by like an eternity for the hidden warriors. The air inside the horse became heavier and heavier, and the space seemed to shrink with each passing moment. Some men prayed silently to the gods, others concentrated on their breathing, controlling their growing anxiety. Outside, the last of the partygoers finally succumbed to exhaustion. Sleepy guards made their rounds less rigorously than usual, confident that the war was over. The city gradually sank into a deep silence, interrupted only by the occasional bark of a dog or hoot of an owl. Odysseus waited until the moon reached its highest point in the sky. It was the moment they had agreed to start the operation. With precise, silent gestures, he began to transmit orders to his men. The opening mechanism was activated with extreme care. producing only a slight creak that was lost in the night. One by one, the warriors began to descend from their horses, moving like shadows in the darkness. Their armor had been carefully wrapped in cloth to minimize any metallic noise. Diomedes led a group towards the main gates, while Neoptolemus and others headed for strategic points in the city. In the palace, Cassandra woke up startled from an uneasy sleep. Her eyes widened in the dark as she heard almost imperceptible sounds coming from the main square. She ran to alert the guards, but her words, as always, were met with disdain and irritation. The Greek warriors moved with calculated precision, silently eliminating the few guards they found in their path. Years of training and planning showed in every coordinated movement, in every precise and deadly blow. Diomedes and his group reached the main gates without encountering any significant resistance. The locking mechanisms were methodically removed, paving the way for the army waiting in the shadows beyond the walls. A torch signal was discreetly sent out, visible only to eyes that knew where to look. On the distant beach, the Greek ships began their silent return, propelled by rowers who kept their oars wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound of contact with the water. Agamemnon, on board the main ship, watched the sleeping city with a mixture of anticipation and satisfaction. Inside Troy, the operation continued with lethal efficiency. Neoptolemus and his men had taken up crucial positions, eliminating guard posts and preparing for the moment when the rest of the army would enter the city. The young warrior felt the blood of his father, Achilles, boiling in his veins, eager to prove his worth in the battle to come. Helena, still awake in her quarters, was the first to notice that something was wrong. The silence of the night had become different, denser, more threatening. When she looked out of the window again, she noticed furtive movements in the shadows of the square. But before she could shout a warning, the first wave of the Greek army was already passing through the open gates. The attack began as a deadly whisper and quickly turned into a roar of war. The Trojans, drunk and unprepared, awoke to find their city already partially taken. The sound of metal against metal began to echo through the streets, mingling with cries of surprise and terror. Odysseus, watching the chaos unfold as planned, headed with a select group towards the royal palace. His aim was to capture Priam and the main Trojan leaders before they could organize any kind of effective resistance. The stratagem he had devised was finally bearing fruit, turning 10 years of stalemate into a decisive victory in a matter of hours. The night that had begun in celebration was quickly turning into a nightmare for the Trojans. The wooden horse, now empty, stood like a silent sentinel in the square, witnessing the fall of the city that had remained invincible for so long. Cunning had triumphed where brute force had failed, and the fate of Troy was sealed. The flames began to spread across Troy, illuminating the night with an eerie glow. Odysseus' plan had worked with devastating precision, and now the city that had resisted for a decade was succumbing in a matter of hours. The cries of battle mingled with the wails of the citizens, creating a chaotic symphony of destruction. Priam, awoken by the tumult, rushed to the throne room. His personal guards, still dazed, were trying to organize a belated defense of the palace. The old king watched with growing horror as his invincible city was taken from within. Through the palace windows, he could see the wooden horse, now an empty silhouette against the burning sky, a monument to his own naivety. Neoptolemus, thirsting for glory and revenge, led a group of warriors through the halls of the palace. His path was marked by ruthless violence, eliminating any resistance he encountered. The young warrior sought to prove himself worthy of the legacy of his father, Achilles, surpassing him in ferocity. Helena, trapped in her chambers, watched as Greek soldiers stormed through the palace. Her beauty, which had launched this war, now seemed insignificant in the face of the horror unfolding before her. Paris tried to protect her, but was quickly subdued by more experienced Greek warriors. The prince who had once defied the gods for love now lay wounded, unable to defend the one he had risked everything for. Cassandra, in the midst of the chaos, ran through the corridors shouting, "I told you so! I told you so!" her prophecies finally confirmed in the most terrible way possible. Her words, previously ignored, now mingled with the screams of terror and the crackling of the flames consuming the city. Ajax the Lesser, on spotting her, began a relentless pursuit through the corridors of Athena's temple. Odysseus, maintaining his characteristic strategic calm even in the midst of battle, coordinated groups of warriors to ensure that no important member of the royal family escaped. His plan was not just limited to conquering the city. It included the complete elimination of Priam's lineage to avoid future revenge. In the palace courtyard, Diomedes and his men faced the last organized resistance from the Trojan guards. The Greek warrior demonstrated why he was considered one of the most lethal in his army, his precise and deadly movements discouraging any attempt at a counterattack. Priam, seeing his city fall, took refuge at the altar of Zeus with some members of his family. The old king, who had once ruled one of the most powerful kingdoms in the known world, was now reduced to begging the gods for protection. Neoptolemus, finding him there, showed no mercy. The sacred altar was stained with royal blood, a sacrilege that would not go unnoticed by the gods. Andromache, Hector's widow, was desperately trying to protect her son Astyanax. She knew that the Greeks would not allow any male heir of Priam's line to survive. Her maternal love led her to try to hide the boy, but the Greek soldiers were systematic in their search. The streets of Troy became a maze of terror and destruction. Citizens ran in panic, seeking refuge in temples and sanctuaries that would soon be desecrated. The Greek warriors, drunk on victory and thirsty for revenge, made no distinction between combatants and civilians. The Greek army waiting outside the walls now flooded the city in successive waves. Agamemnon, arriving in the center of the city, gazed with wild satisfaction at the realization of his decade-long goal. The fall of Troy would be remembered for generations as a testament to both Greek ingenuity and the fragility of power. Meanwhile, in the lower streets of a city, systematic looting began. Treasures accumulated over generations were plundered, temples were stripped of their riches, and the population was subjected to all kinds of violence. The code of warrior honor that had prevailed during the 10-year siege was giving way to unbridled brutality. Odysseus, observing the destruction his plan had unleashed, felt a mixture of pride and regret. His cunning had ensured Greek victory, but the price in lives and the level of destruction exceeded even his darkest expectations. The flames that consumed Troy illuminated not only the end of a city, but also the end of an era. Dawn found Troy unrecognizable. The walls that had been her pride for so long were now stained with blood and soot. The wooden horse stood in the main square, a silent witness to the transformation of a divine gift into an instrument of destruction. The Trojan survivors, those who had not been killed or enslaved, watched helplessly as their city was systematically destroyed. The women of the royal family, including Cassandra and Andromache, were divided up as booty among the victors. Their fate as bleak as that of the city they had once called home. When the sun finally rose fully over the smoking ruins, the magnitude of the destruction became clear. Troy, the city that had held out for 10 years against the greatest army ever assembled, had fallen not by force of arms, but by the cunning of a single plan. The wooden horse would remain in the memory of future generations as an eternal symbol of how intelligence can triumph where brute force fails, and how misplaced trust can lead to total destruction. The gods, from the top of Mount Olympus, watched the outcome of their mortal interferences and disputes. The fall of Troy marked not only the end of a war, but the beginning of a new era of stories and legends that would be told and retold through the centuries, reminding everyone that even the mightiest cities can fall in the face of well-planned cunning. In the bustling streets of Agrabah, where the intense sun turned the sand into a golden carpet, Aladdin leapt nimbly between the market stalls. His bare feet already knew every stone and every shortcut in the city that was both his home and his playground. With his shaggy black hair and threadbare clothes, he might have looked like just another young beggar to the hurried shopkeepers. But his charismatic smile, and sparkling eyes revealed a different soul. "Catch thief!" The cry echoed through the market as Aladdin, with a loaf of newly acquired bread under his arm, deftly dodged the crowd. Beside him, his faithful companion Abu, a small brown-furred monkey, chirped excitedly, also carrying his share of the booty. "It's not stealing to survive, is it, Abu?" Aladdin winked at his furry friend as he dodged down a narrow alleyway. The furious vendor lagged behind, shaking his fists in the air. For Aladdin, every day was a new adventure on the streets of Agrabah, even if not always for the noblest of reasons. At the same moment, inside the majestic palace that towered over the city like a glittering jewel, Princess Jasmine watched the horizon from her golden balcony. Her long black hair danced in the brief desert breeze, while her pet tiger, Raja, rested lazily at her feet. The princess sighed, bored with the walls that imprisoned her and the rules that dictated her life. "Another suitor today, Raja," she murmured, stroking the tiger's head. "Another arrogant prince who only sees a crown, not a person." The animal growled in sympathy. The laws of the kingdom were clear. Jasmine had to marry a prince before her next birthday, which was fast approaching. Meanwhile, in the depths of the palace, Grand Vizier Jafar was plodding in his gloomy office. Tall and slender, with his black and red robes and snake-shaped staff, he was the embodiment of ambition. Next to him, Iago, his sarcastic red parrot, watched as the vizier consulted ancient scrolls. "The lamp must be somewhere, Iago," Jafar muttered, his black eyes shining with malice. "And when I find it, not even the Sultan can stand in the way of my destiny to rule Agrabah." His obsession with the legendary magic lamp grew by the day, as did his plans to usurp the throne. Back on the streets, Aladdin finally reached his refuge, an abandoned building at the top of the city with a privileged view of the palace. Sharing his bread with Abu, he watched the sun set over the golden domes. "Look at that, Abu," he said, pointing to the palace. "People with so much, while others have so little." The monkey nodded, chewing thoughtfully. "One day, friend, things will be different. One day we'll live in a palace, have servants and treasures." His reverie was interrupted by a commotion in the streets below. A new prince was arriving to woo the princess, his extravagant entourage pushing people out of the way. Aladdin watched with disgust at the display of arrogance. The next day, Aladdin was again in the market streets when he saw something that would change his life forever. A little girl was crying after a cruel shopkeeper snatched an apple from her hands. Without thinking twice, Aladdin grabbed an apple from another stall and handed it to the little girl, who smiled gratefully before running off. It was at that moment that he saw her, a young woman of extraordinary beauty, watching the scene with approval. Jasmine had escaped from the palace disguised in simple clothes, determined to experience life beyond the royal walls. Their gazes met, and something inexplicable passed between them. Before Aladdin could approach, palace guards appeared, searching for the missing princess. In the ensuing confusion, a mysterious old man approached Aladdin, whispering about a magical cave in the desert and a treasure that could change his life. "Only someone with a pure heart can enter the Cave of Wonders," said the old man, who was actually Jafar in disguise. "Someone like you, young man." Aladdin, still thinking about the mysterious market girl and dreaming of a better life, didn't notice the malice in the old man's eyes. He accepted the proposal, unaware that he was about to be involved in an adventure far greater than he could have imagined. That night, as the moon illuminated the desert dunes, Aladdin and Abu followed the mysterious old man out of the city. The Cave of Wonders appeared out of the sand like an apparition, the head of an enormous tiger with eyes as bright as rubies. "Remember," warned the old man, "bring me only the lamp. All the rest of the treasure you find will be yours." His words were honey, but they hid poison. Aladdin looked at Abu, who was clinging nervously to his shoulder. "Well, friend, what could possibly go wrong?" He smiled, trying to hide his own apprehension. With a determined step, he crossed the fangs of the cave, descending into the mysterious depths that would change his fate forever. What he didn't know was that that night would mark the beginning of a journey that would test not only his courage, but also his character. a story where he would discover that true riches don't always shine the brightest, and that love can be found in the most unexpected places. Meanwhile, above the city, Princess Jasmine was also thinking about the kind young man she had met in the market, without imagining that their paths were about to cross in ways that neither of them could have foreseen. The darkness of the Cave of Wonders engulfed Aladdin and Abu as they descended a long stone staircase. The young man held a torch that the mysterious old man had given him, its dancing flames casting sinister shadows on the ancient walls. Abu clung tightly to his friend's shoulder, his small eyes wide with apprehension. "Calm down, Abu," whispered Aladdin, trying to sound more confident than he really felt. "Think of all the treasures we could find down here. We'll never have to steal to eat again." As they advanced, the cave opened up into a gigantic chamber that took Aladdin's breath away. Mountains of gold, jewels, and precious artifacts stretched as far as the eye could see, shining like earthly stars in the light of his torch. Abu immediately jumped off Aladdin's shoulder, mesmerized by an enormous ruby the size of an orange. "Abu no," Aladdin warned, remembering the old man's warning. "We can only touch the lamp, remember?" The monkey pouted, but reluctantly moved away from the tempting jewel. As they crossed the sea of riches, Aladdin couldn't help thinking about the girl in the market. With all that wealth, perhaps he could impress her, offer her a life of comfort and luxury. His thoughts were interrupted when something caught his eye, an ornate carpet floating a few centimeters above the ground. "Abu, do you see that?" Aladdin rubbed his eyes in disbelief. The carpet, realizing it had been noticed, waved one of its tassels as if greeting the visitors. "It's a flying carpet, a magic carpet." The carpet approached gracefully, making a theatrical bow that drew laughter from Aladdin. Abu, initially frightened, soon found himself fascinated by his new magical companion. The carpet began to make animated gestures, as if it wanted to show them something. "Do you know where the lamp is?" asked Aladdin. The carpet nodded vigorously and began to float towards a distant staircase. "Good. Show me the way, friend." Outside the cave, Jafar maintained his elder disguise, but his patience was beginning to wear thin. "That brat is taking too long," he grumbled to Yago, who was hiding in his robes. "The lamp should be in my hands before dawn." Back inside the cave, Aladdin, Abu, and their new magical friend reached an isolated chamber. In the center, on a high stone pedestal, rested an old, unadorned bronze lamp. Mysterious rays of light converged on it, as if the whole place had been built to protect this simple object. "All this way for that old lamp," Aladdin commented, carefully climbing the steps of the pedestal. Abu made a sound of disappointment, clearly more interested in the treasures they had left behind. When Aladdin finally picked up the lamp, a strange sensation ran through his body, as if he were holding something alive and pulsating. Before he could examine his discovery further, a high-pitched scream echoed through the chamber. Abu had succumbed to temptation and grabbed a huge red jewel. The ground began to shake violently, and a thunderous voice reverberated throughout the cave. "You have perverted the forbidden treasure. Now you will suffer the consequences." "Abu, what have you done?" Aladdin shouted, as the walls began to crumble and bubbling lava gushed out of the ground. The flying carpet quickly glided towards them, offering an escape route. The desperate escape through the collapsing cave was a blur of movement and chaos. The carpet zigzagged between collapsing pillars and jets of lava, while Aladdin clung tightly to the lamp with one hand and Abu with the other. Behind them, a veritable tsunami of treasure and destruction was chasing them. "I can see the way out," Aladdin shouted hopefully, spotting moonlight through the cave's fangs. However, a giant rock came crashing down on the carpet, throwing them into a wall. Aladdin managed to cling to a rocky ledge, but was rapidly losing strength. Up above, the old man held out his wrinkled hand. "Quickly, young man, give me the lamp, and I'll pull you up." "Hang on, Abu," Aladdin shouted, trying to reach the outstretched hand while protecting his furry friend. With a lot of effort, he managed to hand the lamp to the old man, who immediately changed his worried expression to one of evil triumph. "Finally," Jafar exclaimed, his voice returning to normal as he ripped off his disguise. "After all these years, you," Aladdin gasped, recognizing the dreaded vizier of the palace. Before he could react, Jafar stepped on his toes with force. "Your reward for your services," he laughed cruelly, watching Aladdin and Abu plummet into the darkness of the collapsing cave. The flying carpet dived after them, tried to catch up, but it was too late. The last thing Aladdin saw before losing consciousness was Jafar's triumphant face disappearing as the cave entrance closed forever, sealing them in the dark depths. Hours passed before Aladdin regained consciousness. He was lying in a small natural cave, dimly lit by phosphorescent crystals on the walls. Abu and the flying carpet were beside him, the monkey anxiously trying to wake him up. "I'm fine, Abu," Aladdin groaned, slowly sitting up. "But we're stuck down here." His gaze wandered around the cave until he noticed something glowing in a corner. The lamp. Apparently, during the confusion, Abu had managed to steal it back from Jafar. "You're amazing, you know that?" Aladdin laughed, hugging his little friend. Picking up the lamp, he noticed an almost faded inscription on its surface. "There's something written here, but it's very dirty." He began to rub the lamp with the sleeve of his robe, without imagining that this simple gesture was about to change his life forever. The lamp began to shake in his hands, emanating a bright blue light. Colored smoke poured out of the nozzle, filling the small cave as a powerful, jovial voice echoed. "A year, 10,000 years can give you quite a Kate." The blue smoke gradually solidified into the shape of a colossal, imposing figure with bright blue skin and a small black tuft on his head. The genius, as he introduced himself with a theatrical bow, filled the small cave with his magnetic presence and exuberant personality. "Wow, wow, wow, look what we have here," the genie exclaimed, materializing several spotlights that illuminated Aladdin. "My new master, allow me to introduce myself properly." With a snap of his fingers, a lively tune began to play out of nowhere as the genie multiplied into several versions of himself, each with a different instrument. Aladdin and Abu watched in amazement as the genie performed a musical number explaining the rules of the 3 wishes. Rule number 1, I can't kill anyone. Rule number 2, I can't make anyone fall in love. And rule number 3, I can't bring anyone back from the dead. Other than that, just ask. 3 wishes? Aladdin asked, still trying to process the surreal situation. Anything? Well, there are some limitations, as I mentioned in the song, which by the way was sensational, don't you think? The genie winked, prompting a small audience of applause. But yes, practically anything. Riches, fame, power. Although I'd always suggest starting with getting out of this cave, considering the circumstances. Aladdin smiled cunningly. What if I don't use a wish to get out of here? What if you take us out of the goodness of your heart? The genie was momentarily speechless before bursting into laughter. Ah, that's clever. It's been a long time since I've met a master with a sense of humor. But okay, you win, kid. I'll get you out of here for free, as a courtesy to the house. With one dramatic movement, the genie transformed into a rocket, grabbed Aladdin, Abu and the carpet, and shot through the ceiling of the cave, punching through layers and layers of rock until they emerged in an oasis in the middle of the desert, under the starry sky. "And here we are," announced the genie, returning to his original form. "Now about those 3 wishes." Aladdin sat on the edge of a small pond, thinking deeply. The image of the mysterious market girl, who he still didn't know was Princess Jasmine, danced in his mind. "Genie, have you ever fallen in love?" The question took the magical being by surprise. His usually playful expression softened. "Well, in 10,000 years you end up seeing a lot of love pass by. But personally, let's just say it's hard to maintain a relationship when you live in a lamp. There's this girl," Aladdin began, and the genie immediately transformed into a therapist with glasses and a notepad. "She's amazing, but she's a princess, and the law says she can only marry a prince." "Ah, the classic forbidden love dilemma," Genie exclaimed dramatically. "You know, there's a very obvious solution to that." He snapped his fingers, and suddenly Aladdin found himself dressed in luxurious royal clothes. "Can you turn me into a prince?" Aladdin's eyes lit up at the possibility. I can turn you into anything you want, boy. Prince, king, emperor, even a movie critic, although I wouldn't recommend the last option. The genie joked, making royal poses. Aladdin stood up, excited. So, Genie, I wish you to turn me into the richest and most powerful Prince Agrabah has ever seen. Your wishes are my orders, master. With a grand gesture, the genie began to weave his magic. Rays of colored light enveloped Aladdin, transforming his shabby clothes into a white and gold costume worthy of royalty. Abu was transformed into an elegant elephant, while magical fireworks exploded in the night sky. Presenting, announced the genie in an announcer's voice, His Royal Highness, Prince Ali Ababwa. Meanwhile, in the palace, Jafar was furious. His frantic search for the lamp in his chambers had yielded no results. That miserable monkey must have stolen it, he vociferated, knocking objects off his desk. Maybe it's time to change tack, suggested Iago, his parrot. The princess still has to get married before the next sunset. Jafar's eyes twinkled with mischief. Yes, perhaps it's time to convince the Sultan to see things my way. His snake-shaped staff began to glow ominously. The next morning, Agrabah awoke to an unprecedented spectacle. A grand procession was crossing the city streets, led by a young prince on a majestic white elephant. Dancers, musicians, and servants handed out gold coins to the amazed populace. The genie, disguised as a royal advisor, enthusiastically coordinated the show, occasionally transforming himself into different people in the crowd to start chants of Prince Ali. Magnificent is he, Ali Ababwa. At the palace, Jasmine watched the procession from her balcony with disinterest. Just another arrogant prince, she sighed to Raja. However, there was something familiar about that young man that she couldn't quite identify. Aladdin, or Prince Ali, felt his heart racing as he approached the palace. Under all that luxury and pomp, he was still the same boy from the streets, dreaming of winning the heart of a princess. What he didn't know was that his journey of self-discovery had only just begun, and that the greatest lessons about love, honesty, and courage were yet to come. The big question on his mind was, how long could he keep up the charade? And more importantly, when the truth came out, would his true self be enough to win not just a kingdom, but the heart of a princess? The great hall of the palace shone with sunlight through the colorful stained glass windows when Prince Ali was introduced to the Sultan. The chubby, good-natured ruler was immediately charmed by the young visitor, especially after Aladdin presented him with a golden mechanical watch that the genie had conjured up. Extraordinary, simply extraordinary, exclaimed the Sultan, examining the gift with sparkling eyes. You must know my daughter, Jasmine. She's not interested. Jasmine's firm voice echoed through the hall as she entered, her tiger Raja following her faithfully. Her eyes met Aladdin's, and for a moment, something familiar seemed to pass between them. Jafar watched the scene from the shadows, his fingers gripping his staff with increasing strength. Just another insignificant prince, he muttered to Iago. But there's something about him that bothers me. Determined to impress the princess, Aladdin approached with an elegant bow. Your Highness, I know you must be tired of suitors, but I ask only for a chance to prove myself. Jasmine raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the unusual humility in his words. And how do you intend to do that, Prince Ali? With a confident smile, Aladdin held out his hand. How about a walk? I promise to show you a whole new perspective of Agrabah. The magic carpet was waiting on the palace balcony, disguised as an ordinary carpet. When Jasmine hesitantly accepted Aladdin's hand and climbed onto it, her eyes widened in surprise as she watched him gently levitate. Trust me, whispered Aladdin, words that echoed a distant memory in Jasmine's mind. The carpet took off smoothly, carrying them beyond the palace walls. The city stretched out below them like a living map, the streets winding between the buildings like golden rivers under the setting sun. Jasmine couldn't contain her admiration, her fingers entwined firmly in Aladdin's. It's incredible, she sighed, as they flew over the rooftops where, unbeknownst to her, Aladdin used to sleep. I've never seen Agrabah like this. As they flew, Aladdin began to show a surprisingly intimate knowledge of the city and its people. He pointed to a small square where children played, told stories about the market traders, and shared secrets that only someone who lived on the streets could know. How do you know so much about the lives of ordinary people? Jasmine asked, her curiosity growing. Aladdin hesitated, his heart torn between the truth and the need to maintain his charade. I believe that a true leader must know all aspects of his kingdom, not just the palaces. As night fell, they landed on a distant rooftop, sharing a simple meal that Genius had discreetly provided. The stars began to dot the dark sky, and conversation flowed naturally between them. "You know," said Jasmine, "you're different from the other princes. There's something about you that reminds me of—" She stopped, studying his face more closely. Aladdin's heart raced. "Reminds you of what?" "Someone I met at the market," she replied slowly. "A young man who helped a child in need." Before Aladdin could reply, an eerie glow caught his eye. In the palace, red lights emanated from the tower where Jafar's chambers were located. The vizier was busy with his own plot. "The staff is almost ready, Iago," Jafar muttered, adding ingredients to a bubbling cauldron. "Soon, its hypnotic power will be strong enough to control even the Sultan." Back on the roof, Jasmine and Aladdin shared a moment of contemplative silence. "Ali," she finally said, "sometimes I feel like I'm trapped in a life I didn't choose. Do you understand that?" Aladdin felt the weight of his own lie. "More than you know," he replied softly. "Sometimes appearances can be deceiving." When they returned to the palace, something had changed between them. Jasmine no longer saw just a suitor, but someone who seemed to truly understand her. And Aladdin, despite the guilt growing in his chest, was more in love than ever. The genie, who watched discreetly as he became a star in the sky, sighed, "Ah, young love, so beautiful and so complicated." That night, as Aladdin walked through the palace gardens, lost in thought about Jasmine, a shadow moved in the darkness. Jafar emerged from the bushes, his staff glowing menacingly. "Impressive demonstration, Prince Ali," he said with false cordiality. "Or should I say, Aladdin?" Aladdin's blood ran cold in his veins. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, but you do." Jafar smiled mischievously. "The street rat I found in the Cave of Wonders. I wonder what the princess would say if she knew the truth about her precious prince." Aladdin kept his composure, even though his heart was pounding frantically. "Your accusations are as empty as your loyalty to the Sultan." Jafar's smile only widened. "Be careful, boy. You're not the only one with secrets in this palace." With those words, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Aladdin with an even heavier burden on his heart. In his makeshift room, Aladdin found the genie playing chess with himself. "Genie, what do I do? I can't keep lying to her." The genie paused his game, looking seriously at his friend. "The truth is a funny way of coming out, Al. The longer you wait, the more painful it will be." But before Aladdin could consider a confession, a guard rushed into his chambers. "Prince Ali, the Sultan requests your immediate presence in the throne room. It's about the princess." Aladdin's heart raced as he ran through the palace corridors. As he entered the throne room, he found a disturbing scene. The Sultan was in a trance, his glazed eyes fixed on the red glow of Jafar's staff. Jasmine was handcuffed, guards holding her tightly as she struggled. "Ah, Prince Ali, how nice of you to join us." Jafar smiled mischievously. "Or should I say, the street rat? Dad, wake up. Jafar is controlling you." Jasmine shouted, but the Sultan remained motionless. "The Sultan has seen the truth about his favorite suitor," Jafar proclaimed, his voice echoing through the hall. "A liar, a common thief who dared to pass himself off as royalty." "It's a lie." Aladdin advanced, but guards quickly surrounded him. Abu, still in elephant form, tried to help, but Jafar turned him back into a small monkey with a flick of his staff. "The magic!" Jasmine gasped, realizing. "So you're not really a prince?" The look of disappointment in Jasmine's eyes went through Aladdin like a dagger. "Jasmine, I can explain." "Guards," Jafar ordered, "take this impostor to the dungeons. The sentence for deceiving the royal family is death at dawn." As he was dragged away, Aladdin saw the genie floating invisibly near the ceiling, his expression anguished. He could use his second wish to escape, but that would mean leaving Jasmine and the kingdom in Jafar's hands. In the dungeons, chained to the cold wall, Aladdin finally let the weight of his lies fall on his shoulders. Abu snuggled up next to him, trying to comfort him. "I've ruined everything, Abu," he whispered. "I should have told you the truth from the start." A familiar blue glow filled the cell as the genie appeared. "It's not over yet, Al. You still have 2 wishes. What kind of person would I be if I used magic to solve my problems again?" Aladdin replied bitterly. "That's how this mess started. Sometimes, Al, the real magic isn't in the wishes, but in what we do with them," the genie said wisely. Just then, the magic carpet slid through the bars of the cell window, bringing with it a surprise. "Jasmine, you have 1 minute to explain everything to me," she said firmly, her eyes shining with a mixture of anger and hope. "The truth is, I'm just Aladdin, a thief of the streets," he confessed, finally setting his heart free. "I found a magic lamp, and the genie turned me into a prince because I wanted to be worthy of you. But I realized too late that true nobility doesn't come from titles or wealth." "The boy from the market," Jasmine whispered, the pieces falling into place. "It was you all along." Before they could continue, they heard footsteps approaching. "Jafar is using dark magic to control your father," Aladdin explained quickly. "He wants the throne for himself. And I have proof." The genie appeared, transformed into a detective with a magnifying glass. "That chatty parrot of his can't keep a secret." Jasmine nodded determinedly. "We need to stop him." "But how?" "I have a plan," Aladdin smiled, his old adventurous spirit returning. "But it will require all of us to work together." In the throne room, Jafar savored his imminent triumph, forcing the hypnotized sultan to sign decrees that would make him the new ruler. Iago flew around in circles, humming about his future as a royal parrot. Suddenly, the doors opened. Jasmine walked in, seemingly submissive. "You win, Jafar. I agree to marry you." "Excellent choice, princess." Jafar smiled victoriously, not noticing the magic carpet gliding silently behind him. Meanwhile, Aladdin, freed by one of the genie's tricks, was sneaking around the pillars of the hole. The plan was simple: distract Jafar long enough to break his staff, the source of his hypnotic power. But before the wedding, Jasmine continued, approaching seductively. "Wouldn't you like to see how you look with a crown?" Jafar's ego couldn't resist the temptation. When he reached out to take the crown Jasmine offered, Aladdin jumped up, grabbing the staff. Jafar roared, his mask of sophistication falling away completely. In the ensuing struggle, the staff slipped out of both their hands, shattering as it hit the ground. A wave of magical energy swept through the hole, releasing the sultan from his trance. "Guards, arrest the traitor," the sultan ordered, finally aware of Jafar's treachery. But Jafar had one last card. "If I can't take the throne by cunning, I'll take it by force." He pulled out the lamp he had stolen from Aladdin during the confusion. "Genie, my first wish. Make me the most powerful being in the world." Aladdin shouted, but it was too late. The genie, forced to obey, transformed Jafar into an all-powerful sorcerer. The vizier grew to the ceiling, his black robes turning into gloomy smoke. "Now, let's see who the real ruler of Agrabah is," Jafar thundered, launching bolts of energy that turned everything they touched into black gold. In the midst of the chaos, Aladdin realized something crucial. "Jasmine," he shouted over the roar of magic. "Do you trust me?" Their eyes met through the magical storm, and in that moment, all lies and disguises disappeared. "I do," she replied. "Then hold on tight." Aladdin whistled, and the magic carpet caught them in mid-flight, dodging Jafar's attacks as they executed the final part of the plan. "Why are you running away from me?" Jafar roared. "I'm the most powerful being in the world." "Almost that," Aladdin teased. "The genie is even more powerful. He gave you your powers, and he can take them away." Jafar's eyes shone with understanding and greed. Yes, Genie, my second wish. Make me an all-powerful genie." The genie covered his eyes, not wanting to see, but compelled to fulfill the wish. Jafar began to transform, his body growing and changing until he became a colossal red genie. The power, the absolute power. Jafar laughed, not noticing the black lamp that materialized at his feet, nor the golden chains that began to bind his wrists. "You forgot something, Jafar," Aladdin shouted. "Geniuses have a lot of power, but zero freedom." "No," Jafar shouted when he realized the trap, being sucked into his own lamp along with Iago, who had tried to escape too late. With Jafar defeated, peace returned to the palace. The Sultan, impressed by Aladdin's bravery and intelligence, declared that the law was wrong. His daughter should have the right to marry whomever her heart chose. "And now?" Jasmine asked, entwining her fingers in Aladdin's. "Now," he smiled, picking up the genie's lamp, "there's one more thing I need to do." Turning to his blue friend, he declared, "Genie, I wish you freedom." With a flash of light and the sound of chains breaking, the genie's bracelets fell off, and his smoke-shaped legs turned into real feet. For the first time in millennia, he was truly free. "Ow," the genie smiled, tears in his eyes. "You are a true prince, not by magic or title, but by your heart." And so, under the starry sky of Agrabah, Aladdin and Jasmine discovered that true love doesn't need disguises or magical wishes, just the courage to be who you really are. The small town of Sarah Das Cruzes has always been shrouded in mystery. Situated between imposing mountains and deep valleys, it was the kind of place where ancient stories were passed down from generation to generation, whispered by the fire on cold winter nights. Miguel Santos, a young 28-year-old veterinarian, never gave much thought to these legends until that fateful Friday night. His veterinary practice was on the edge of town, next to the old road that snaked through the forest. Miguel was just finishing organizing his notes on the last patient of the day, an old dog with joint problems, when he heard desperate knocks on the door. It was Dona Helena, a lady who kept sheep on her property nearby. "Dr. Miguel, please, I need help," she exclaimed, panting. "Something is attacking my sheep. I've already lost 3 this week alone, and now there's one seriously injured." Miguel grabbed his emergency bag and followed Dona Helena in his jeep along the dirt road. The sky was clear, and a majestic full moon illuminated the road, casting unsettling shadows between the centuries-old trees. As he drove, he couldn't help but notice how the air seemed thicker that night. At Dona Helena's small farm, they found the injured sheep in the stable. The wounds were unlike anything Miguel had ever seen in his years of work. They weren't the typical marks of attacks by jaguars or other predators in the region. There were deep lacerations, but also what looked like human handprints. "Mrs. Helena, have you noticed anything strange in recent days? Any different animals hanging around the property?" asked Miguel as he treated the animal's wounds. The lady hesitated for a moment, her gaze lost in the darkness beyond the stable window. "Doctor, you must think I'm an old fool, but there's something in the old stories. My grandfather always talked about the nights of the full moon, especially on Fridays." Miguel continued his work in silence, but Dona Helena's words provoked a restlessness that he couldn't explain. It was then that they heard a distant howl, unlike any sound they had ever heard before. It was no ordinary wolf or dog. It was something between the two of them, something that made the hairs on the back of Miguel's neck stand on end. The town was also home to Clara Mendez, a young history teacher who had recently returned after years studying in the capital. She was particularly interested in local legends and had started researching the region's old families. In her search, she discovered that the Silva family, one of the oldest in the city, had a peculiar tradition. Whenever 7 consecutive male children were born, the youngest was baptized with a special name and kept under constant surveillance during the nights of the full moon. Clara didn't know it, but her research would lead her to discover a surprising connection with Miguel. His grandfather, João Santos, had been the 7th son in a family of 7 brothers, all men. Miguel never paid any attention to this detail of his family history, but the coincidences were starting to pile up in a disturbing way. That same evening, as Miguel was returning home after seeing Dona Helena, he felt a strange sensation take over his body. It was as if something inside him wanted to wake up, something primitive and wild. His hands began to shake on the steering wheel, and drops of cold sweat ran down his forehead, despite the chilly night air. Clara, who lived in a house near the main road, was poring over old parish registers when she heard a crash coming from the street. Looking out of the window, she saw Miguel's Jeep stopped anyway on the roadside, with the driver's door open. There was no sign of him anywhere. The full moon shone with extraordinary intensity, and the wind carried ancient whispers through the trees. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine when she found, among the documents she was studying, an old photograph of the Santos family. On the back, there was a note in shaky handwriting. May God protect the seventh son on the nights of the full moon. The oldest inhabitants of Sarah Das Cruzes always knew that there was something different about the nights of the full moon. People avoided going out after dark, locked their houses tightly, and kept their animals safe. But now, with the increasingly frequent attacks and Miguel's mysterious condition, the old legends were beginning to take on new shades of reality. Dona Helena, in her wisdom of years, realized that something bigger was about to happen. She kept a secret that could help her understand the whole situation, but she feared the consequences of revealing what she knew. Her family had been in the area for generations and knew the real reasons behind the curse that plagued certain families in the town. As the night progressed, Miguel found himself lost in the forest, struggling with a transformation he didn't understand, while Clara began to put together the pieces of an ancient puzzle that could change the fate of Sarah Das Cruzes forever. The full moon continued its journey across the sky, a silent witness to a story that was only just beginning to unfold. The next morning, Miguel woke up by a stream, his clothes torn and dirty with dirt. Confusing fragments of the night before populated his mind like scattered pieces of a nightmare. His body ached, and there were scratches on his arms that he couldn't explain. He got up groggily, trying to find his way around the familiar landscape of the forest that surrounded Sarah Das Cruzes. Clara, who had barely slept, spent the early hours of the morning organizing her findings. The parish records revealed a disturbing pattern. Every 7 generations, a series of mysterious attacks plagued the region, always coinciding with the birth of the 7th child in one of the traditional families. His eyes widened when he realized that the last cycle had occurred exactly at the time of Miguel's birth. On his way home, Miguel met Dona Helena feeding her sheep. The lady watched him with a look that mixed compassion and concern. "Young man," she said softly, "I think it's time you knew some truths about your family." Inside Dona Helena's simple house, as a kettle whirred on the wood-burning stove, she revealed that she had been a close friend of Miguel's grandmother. "Maria Santos knew what was coming," she said, pouring tea in old cups. "She tried to protect her grandfather Joao from the curse, but some things are beyond our control." Meanwhile, Clara decided to visit the veterinary practice, worried about Miguel's disappearance the night before. She found the place closed and, on asking the neighbors, discovered that no one had seen him since last night. A growing restlessness consumed her, fueled by the revelations of her research. At Dona Helena's house, Miguel listened attentively to how his grandmother had consulted an old healer from the region, looking for a way to break the curse that threatened her son. The healer had told him about a ritual that should be performed during the full moon, but Maria died before she was able to carry it out. Her grandfather Joao managed to control the curse for years, explained Dona Helena, but the price was high. He isolated himself in the mountains, avoiding contact with other people on full moon nights. The curse, however, didn't disappear. It just slept, waiting for the next generation. Clara, following her intuition, went to Dona Helena's house. When she arrived, she found Miguel sitting at the kitchen table, his face pale and haggard. The meeting of the three was no coincidence. The ancient forces that ruled Sarah Das Cruzes were weaving their invisible threads, uniting those who needed to be together. The teacher shared her findings, showing the documents she had found. Miguel, still processing the events of the night before, began to accept a truth that his body already knew. The transformations, the attacks on the animals, everything was beginning to make terrible sense. "There's a way to break the curse," said Dona Helena, her voice full of hope. "But we need to act before the next full moon. The ritual your grandmother discovered, Miguel, involves 3 elements. The blood of the cursed, the true name pronounced 3 times by someone with a pure heart, and a sacred object that belonged to the first victim of the curse. Clara, with her historical knowledge, mentioned an ancient silver cross that, according to legend, belonged to the first inhabitant of Sarah Das Cruzes to be attacked by a werewolf. The relic was kept in the town's parish church, protected for generations by the local priest. As the day progressed, the 3 of them began to make a plan. They would only have a few weeks until the next full moon to gather everything they needed for the ritual. Time was short, and the forces opposing them were ancient and powerful. Miguel, still struggling with the fragmented memories of the night before, knew he had to act quickly. Each transformation brought him closer to losing his humanity completely. Clara, for her part, felt that her role in history went beyond that of a mere researcher. There was something in her heart that connected her deeply to this mission. Donna Helena warned them about the dangers they would face. The curse has its guardians, she explained, people and creatures who benefit from the power of transformations and will do anything to prevent you from breaking the cycle. As the sun began to set, the 3 sealed a silent pact. Miguel returned to his office, determined to maintain a semblance of normality for as long as he could. Clara returned to her research, now with an even more urgent purpose, and Donna Helena remained on her property, vigilant, knowing that ancient forces were moving again in Sarah Das Cruzes. Night fell over the town like a heavy cloak, laden with secrets and promises. In the distant mountains, a lonely howl echoed, reminding everyone that the battle between man and beast had only just begun. Miguel, at home, locked all the doors and windows, praying that he could control whatever was growing inside him until they found a solution. For the next week, Clara dedicated herself intensely to researching the Silver Cross. Her days were divided between classes at the local school and long hours in the municipal library, sifting through documents yellowed by time. The information she found was fragmentary, but little by little a dark story began to emerge. Miguel, on the other hand, kept a seemingly normal routine in his office. Although the signs of the curse were becoming increasingly evident, his senses were heightened in a supernatural way. He could hear distant conversations and smell smells that had previously gone unnoticed. At night, vivid dreams tormented him, filled with images of dark forests and wild hunts. During a particularly hectic afternoon in the office, Miguel received an unexpected visit from Father Thomas, an elderly man who had served in the parish church for decades. The priest watched him with penetrating eyes as he talked about the latest events in the city. "I've noticed changes in you, young man," said the priest in a deep voice. "Your grandmother Maria used to come to church every day, praying for your grandfather John. She knew this day would come." Miguel felt a shiver run down his spine. "Did you know about my family?" "The church keeps many secrets," replied the priest. "The silver cross you're looking for isn't just a relic. It's a symbol of hope and redemption, but it's also dangerous in the wrong hands." Meanwhile, Clara was making a crucial discovery in the archives. The cross wasn't just stored in the church. It was hidden in a secret compartment, protected by ancient Latin words. Even more intriguing, only someone with pure blood could touch it without suffering terrible consequences. At her estate, Donna Helena received strange visitors. People from the city who she hadn't seen for years began to show up, asking questions about Miguel and the Santos family. She noticed furtive glances and whispered conversations, signs that others were also aware of the changes taking place. One evening, while Clara was working late on her research, she heard a knock on her door. It was Miguel, visibly upset. "Something's happening in the city," he said, rushing in. "People who have never been interested in my family are asking questions. And today I felt like I was being followed." Clara shared her discoveries about the cross, and together they realized that they were facing a complex web of secrets and interests. The curse didn't just affect Miguel. There were others in the town who depended on its continuity, either for power or fear. After his meeting with Miguel, Father Thomas performed an evening ritual in the church. He lit old candles and murmured prayers in Latin in front of the altar. He knew that time was running out, not just for Miguel, but for everyone who kept the secrets of Sarah Das Cruzes. Clara and Miguel decided to visit Dona Helena again, seeking more information about the ritual needed to break the curse. On the way, they noticed shadows moving among the trees, as if they were being watched by invisible eyes. At Dona Helena's house, they found her preparing a special herbal tea. This will help control the transformations, she explained to Miguel. But it's only temporary. We need to act before the curse becomes permanent. The lady then revealed that the ritual was to be carried out in a specific place, an ancient clearing in the forest where, according to legends, the first transformation took place. The site was marked by stones arranged in a circle, covered in mysterious symbols. While they were talking, a distant howl cut through the night, startling everyone. Miguel felt his body react to the call, a primitive energy coursing through his veins. Clara instinctively took his hand, and for a moment he felt the power of the transformation diminish. The touch of someone with a pure heart can calm the beast, observed Dona Helena, looking meaningfully at Clara. Perhaps it's no coincidence that you've returned to Sarah Das Cruzes just now. The three of them began to plan how to obtain the Silver Cross. Father Thomas could be an ally or an obstacle. It was difficult to determine which side he was really on. Clara suggested a direct approach, arguing that honesty might be their best strategy. However, the forces opposing them were beginning to manifest themselves more openly. Small accidents began to happen. Important documents disappeared from the library. Clara's car suffered a mysterious breakdown, and the animals in Miguel's clinic became increasingly agitated. The crescent moon in the sky reminded everyone that time was precious. Each night that passed brought Miguel a little closer to the point of no return. Clara noticed subtle changes in his behavior. Moments of distraction when his eyes took on a wild gleam. Moments when his voice took on a deeper, huskier tone. Dona Helena, the silent guardian of so many secrets, knew that the crucial moment was approaching. The ancient forces that ruled Sarah Das Cruzes were awakening, and the delicate balance between the world of men and the realm of shadows was about to be upset. The next morning, Clara decided to confront Father Thomas directly. She found him in the church sacristy, organizing old liturgical books. The priest didn't seem surprised by her visit, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "I know why you're here, my child," he said, carefully closing the book he was holding. "The Silver Cross isn't just a sacred object. It's a burden that our community has carried for generations." Clara explained about her findings and the urgency of Miguel's situation. The priest listened attentively, his wrinkled face revealing a mixture of concern and resignation. "There are others interested in the cross," he revealed. "People who believe that the curse is a source of power, not a curse." As they talked, Miguel was facing his own battle in the office. The symptoms of the transformation were becoming harder to control. Even during the day, his canine patients reacted strangely to his presence. Some cowered in fear, others growled defensively. Dona Helena, realizing the seriousness of the situation, began to prepare the ritual. In her kitchen, she mixed ancient herbs in an iron cauldron that had belonged to her grandmother. The strong, mystical aroma filled the room as she murmured ancient words of protection. In the late afternoon, Clara returned from her meeting with the priest with some disturbing news. There was a secret society in Sarah Das Cruzes, made up of families who benefited from the curse. They believed that the werewolf's blood contained mystical properties that guaranteed longevity and power. "The priest showed me old records," Clara explained to Miguel and Dona Helena. "These families have manipulated marriages and births for generations, ensuring that there is always a seventh child to carry the curse." Miguel felt a wave of anger run through his body. "So my family, my grandfather, we were all pawns in a sick game?" Dona Helena nodded sadly. "Your grandmother found out the truth and tried to protect you, Miguel. That's why she insisted that your parents move out of town when you were little." Night was beginning to fall when a group of men showed up at Dona Helena's property. Among them was Ricardo Silva, one of the most influential members of the town. His cordial smile didn't reach his cold eyes. "We've come to talk about family matters," said Ricardo, his soft voice carrying a veiled threat. "After all, we all want the best for our community, don't we?" Clara realized that they needed to act quickly. Father Thomas had given her a crucial piece of information. The silver cross would be at its most powerful during the lunar eclipse that would take place in 3 days' time. Coincidentally, on a full moon night, while Ricardo and his men talked to Dona Helena on the balcony, Clara and Miguel slipped out the back of the house. The special herbal tea kept the transformation under control, but Miguel could feel the beast growing inside him, eager to break free. They arrived at the church as the last lights of the day disappeared over the horizon. Father Thomas was waiting for them, holding an ancient iron key. "The secret compartment is under the altar," he explained. "But remember, only someone with a pure heart can touch the cross." Following the priest's instructions, Clara and Miguel went down a narrow staircase into an underground chamber. The air was heavy with the smell of incense and ancient wax. On the back wall, a small niche held the silver cross, which emanated a supernatural glow in the darkness. Clara reached out her hand, trembling slightly, her fingers touching the cold metal. To her relief, nothing terrible happened. The cross seemed to vibrate gently in her hand, as if it recognized her presence. They barely had time to celebrate their achievement. Heavy footsteps echoed on the stairs, and Ricardo Silva appeared with his men. "Did you really think it would be so easy?" he asked, his voice now stripped of any pretense of cordiality. Father Thomas tried to intervene, but was quickly restrained. Miguel felt the transformation approaching, fueled by danger and anger. Clara clutched the cross to her chest, knowing they couldn't allow it to fall into the wrong hands. "The curse keeps us strong," Ricardo declared. "For centuries, our blood has been purified by the power of the wolves. We will not allow that to end." At that critical moment, Dona Helena appeared at the entrance to the crypt, carrying her cauldron of herbs. With one swift movement, she threw its contents into the air, creating a curtain of aromatic smoke that disoriented the invaders. "Run," she shouted. "Find the sacred clearing before the eclipse." Miguel and Clara took advantage of the confusion to escape, taking the cross with them. They ran through the night, feeling the cold wind on their faces and hearing the angry shouts behind them. The crescent moon watched silently, like an ancient witness to yet another chapter in this never-ending story. The forest welcomed them with its protective darkness, while time ticked inexorably towards the decisive moment. Miguel could feel the wolf's presence growing stronger, and Clara held onto the cross as if her life depended on it, which in a way it did. In the city, the ancient forces of Sarah Das Cruzes were mobilizing. An ancient battle was about to reach its climax, and everyone's fate depended on a race against time, a silver cross, and the power of true love to overcome the darkness. The forest seemed to take on a life of its own as Miguel and Clara ran towards the sacred clearing. The centuries-old trees cast dancing shadows in the moonlight, and mysterious sounds echoed everywhere. Time was short. The lunar eclipse was fast approaching. Miguel felt his body struggling against the imminent transformation. Every step was a Herculean effort to maintain control. Clara, still firmly holding the silver cross, guided the way based on the ancient descriptions she had found in her studies. "There," exclaimed Clara, pointing to an opening between the trees. The sacred clearing revealed itself before them, a perfect circle of ancient stones, each marked with mysterious symbols that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Behind them, they could hear the voices of Richard and his men approaching. The sound of branches breaking and dry leaves being trampled echoed through the forest. The secret society would not give up its ancestral power easily. Dona Helena suddenly appeared from a side path, carrying a worn leather bag. "Quickly," she ordered, starting to arrange black candles at specific points in the stone circle. "The eclipse will begin in minutes." The ritual needed to be executed with precision. The silver cross was placed in the center of the clearing, and Miguel positioned himself next to it. Clara, following Dona Helena's instructions, lit the candles in a specific order, while the old woman scattered herbs in a circular pattern around them. "This is it," said Dona Helena, watching the sky. The moon was slowly beginning to be covered by a dark shadow. "Clara, you need to call Miguel's real name 3 times, but only when the moon is completely eclipsed. Richard and his followers reached the edge of the clearing, but something prevented them from crossing the stone circle. The ancient magic of the place still retained its protective power. "You don't understand what you're doing," shouted Ricardo, his voice filled with fury. "The curse is our heritage." Miguel felt the transformation begin. His bones crackled and his skin burned as if on fire. Clara held his hand tightly, silent tears streaming down her face as she watched him struggle against the change. Father Thomas appeared unexpectedly, limping but determined. "The curse must end," he declared, positioning himself between Ricardo's group and the sacred circle. "For too long we have allowed evil to thrive in the name of power." The moon was almost completely covered now. Miguel fell to his knees, his body convulsing. Clara could see his features beginning to change, his eyes taking on a wild glow. Dona Helena began to chant ancient words, her voice mixing with the wind that was now blowing in circles around them. "Now, Clara," cried Dona Helena as the last bit of the moon disappeared under the shadow of the eclipse. "Say your real name." Clara closed her eyes, her heart beating wildly. "Miguel Joao Santos," she called once, her voice trembling slightly. The candles flickered. "Miguel Joao Santos," she repeated more forcefully. The wind increased, and the old stones began to vibrate. Ricardo and his men tried desperately to break through the invisible barrier that kept them apart. Father Thomas stood firm at his post, muttering prayers in Latin. "Miguel Joao Santos?" Clara shouted for the third time, her voice filled with love and hope. At the same moment, a ray of silver light cut through the darkness of the eclipse, striking the cross in the center of the circle. Miguel screamed, a sound that began as an animal howl and gradually turned into a human cry. His body glowed with an intense light, and everyone had to look away. When the light subsided, he was lying on the ground, completely human. The silence that followed was broken by screams of pain. Richard and his followers fell to their knees, as if an invisible force was crushing them. Centuries of mystical power obtained through the curse were being drained from their bodies. Clara ran to Miguel, hugging him as he slowly regained consciousness. When his eyes opened, they were free of the wild glow that had inhabited them for the last few weeks. The curse had been broken. Dona Helena smiled, tears of joy in her tired eyes. "Your grandmother can rest in peace now," she said softly. "The cycle has finally been broken." The eclipse began to pass, and the moon gradually reappeared in the night sky. Richard and his men had disappeared into the forest, taking with them only the shadows of their lost power. Father Thomas blessed the stone circle one last time before beginning his journey back to the city. In the days that followed, Sarah Das Cruzes underwent a subtle but profound transformation. The old families who had controlled the town through fear and superstition lost their influence. New leaders emerged, bringing with them an era of transparency and renewal. Miguel and Clara remained in the town, helping to build a future where the old legends would only serve as a reminder of a dark time that is now behind us. Dona Helena continued on her property, now using her knowledge to heal and help, no longer to fight ancestral curses. Full moon nights in Sarah Das Cruzes became just another natural phenomenon, no longer filled with terror and mystery. The howls that sometimes echoed through the forest were just those of ordinary wolves, and night travelers no longer feared supernatural encounters on the deserted roads. The silver cross was returned to the church, but now as a symbol of redemption and hope, no longer as a relic of dark power. And on clear nights, when the moon shone over the town, Miguel and Clara walked hand in hand through the square, grateful to have found each other and have helped free their community from a curse that had lasted for generations. The story of the werewolf curse of Sarah Das Cruzes became one more legend among many others, but with a different ending, one that spoke of love, courage, and the possibility of breaking even the oldest and most powerful curses when the heart is in the right place. In the beginning, there was only the vast ocean plunged into infinite darkness. The black waters stretched as far as the eye could see, and the silence was broken only by the gentle movement of the waves that danced eternally without destination. In this primordial setting, a single being stood out, the raven, a majestic creature with black feathers that reflected what little light there was in the void. This was no ordinary crow. Its eyes shone with ancient wisdom, and its wings carried the power of creation itself. Kokoro, as it was known in ancient languages, had emerged from the shadows themselves, born from a thought of the universe. His solitude was his only companion as he flew over the infinite ocean, observing his own reflection in the dark waters. For eons that could not be measured, Kokoro flew without rest, this curious mind constantly searching for something beyond the monotony of darkness. In her heart, a burning desire for change grew, then inexplicable will to transform that emptiness into something more. It was then, in a moment of deep contemplation, that he realized he was not alone in his journey. From the depths of the ocean, an ancient voice emerged, as old as time itself. It was Namaka, the spirit of the primordial waters, who had long been watching Raven in his solitary flight. His presence was manifested through gentle ripples on the surface of the sea, forming patterns that only Kokoro could interpret. "Why do you fly aimlessly, shadow architect?" asked Namaka, his voice echoing across the waters. "What are you looking for in this infinite void?" Kokoro landed on a wave that hung suspended, like a liquid throne created especially for him. "I seek purpose," he replied, his words carrying the weight of 1,000 thoughts. "This world is too vast to remain in the shadows." It was at this moment that Kokoro discovered his true nature. In his wings slept the power to turn dreams into reality. In his beak he carried the ability to shape the shapeless. And in his heart, he held the desire to create something extraordinary. On the endless horizon, Kokoro saw something that no one else could see. 3 small points of light, so distant that they seemed like an illusion. They were the celestial boxes, mystical containers that held the secrets of luminosity. Raven knew, either by instinct or fate, that these objects held the key to transforming that world of darkness. Namaka, sensing Kokoro's thoughts, became restless. "The heavenly boxes are sacred," she warned, her waters shimmering with concern. "They were sealed by the ancients, those who came before us. Disturbing them could bring consequences that even I cannot foresee." But Kokoro had already made up his mind. With a determined flap of his wings, he launched himself towards the heavenly boxes. His journey would not be easy. The shadows themselves seemed to want to keep him away, creating air currents that tried to divert his course. The wind howled with ancient voices, warning of the dangers of his endeavor. As he flew, Kokoro began to understand that it wasn't just the darkness that needed to be transformed. It was the very fabric of reality that was crying out for change. In his flight, he could feel the weight of responsibility on his wings. He was not just a creator, but a guardian of what was to come. The waters beneath him began to churn more strongly, as if the ocean itself was responding to his determination. Namaka, although worried, couldn't help but admire Raven's courage. She knew that this moment would mark the beginning of a new era, for better or worse. As she approached the heavenly boxes, Kokoro could feel the ancient energy emanating from them. Each one pulsed with a different kind of light. One was golden like the brightest sun, another silver like the most delicate moonlight, and the third sparkled with thousands of tiny points of light like the stars that were yet to be born. The challenge before him was monumental. The boxes were protected by mystical seals, created to resist the passage of time in attempts to tamper with them. But Kokoro was no ordinary being. In his essence, he carried the very force of creation, a gift that even he didn't fully understand. Namaka watched everything with growing apprehension. The waters under her domain moved in increasingly complex patterns, reflecting her restlessness. She knew that the balance of the void was about to be altered forever, and the consequences of this change would be irreversible. With a precise movement, Kokoro reached the first box. His bright eyes studied the intricate patterns that sealed it, trying to understand its secrets. He knew that his every action from that moment on would shape, not only the physical world, but also the fate of all beings yet to come. The first seal began to crack under his touch, releasing a thin beam of golden light that cut through the darkness like a sharp blade. It was only the beginning of a transformation that would change the face of that primordial universe forever. Kokoro, the architect of shadows, was about to take the first step on his journey of creation, a journey that would lead him to shape mountains, bring forests to life, and populate the world with beings of all shapes and sizes. The wind whispered ancient prophecies, and the waters danced with renewed energy. The moment of creation had arrived, and with it, the dawn of a new era was about to awaken in the hands, or rather, the wings of the most unlikely of creators, a raven who dared to defy the darkness. The beam of golden light that escaped from the first celestial box grew with every moment, like a primordial dawn that had never been witnessed before. Kokoro kept his beak firmly attached to the seal, his black feathers now bathed in the radiant glow emanating from the box. The power contained therein was greater than he had imagined, and for a brief moment, he felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of his own daring. Namaka watched in fascination and awe as the waters around him began to reflect that strange new light, creating dancing patterns on their surface that had never existed before. "Are you sure you're ready for the consequences of your actions, Kokoro?" His voice echoed across the waves, carrying both concern and reverence. Raven didn't answer immediately, concentrating on his task. With a precise and determined movement, he finally managed to completely break the first seal. The golden box opened in a spectacle of light and heat, releasing the sun in all its primordial glory. The incandescent sphere rose slowly over the dark horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange for the first time. The heat of the newborn sun warmed Kokoro's wings, and he felt a deep satisfaction at seeing his first act of creation manifest itself so majestically. The waters below began to glow with golden reflections, creating a spectacle never before seen in that primordial world. Without wasting any time, Raven turned his attention to the second box, the one that held the moon. The seal on this one was different, more subtle and delicate, as if it had been woven with silver threads. Kokoro realized that he would need a gentler approach this time. Using the tip of his ward, he began to carefully unravel the mystical patterns that held the box shut. As he worked, he noticed that the sun was beginning to establish its first cycle, moving slowly across the newly formed sky. It was crucial that he release the moon before the first night arrived, to maintain the delicate balance that was beginning to form. "The tides respond to your creation," observed Namaka, his waters moving in new rhythms, attracted by the gravitational pull of the sun. "The world is changing, Kokoro, and there's no turning back." Raven knew she was right. His every action was creating new natural laws, establishing patterns that would last for eternity. With even more determination, he focused on the seal of the second box. Its silver feathers glowed with a light of their own now, as if they were absorbing the essence of the moon that was still trapped there. Finally, the second seal gave way, and the silver box opened with a soft sigh. The moon emerged, a pale, serene sphere that began its ascent into the darkening sky. Its soft light created a perfect contrast with the intense brightness of the sun that was now setting for the first time. Kokoro watched in amazement as his first two creations established a celestial dance, a cosmic ballet that would mark the rhythm of life for all the ages to come. Day and night were born at that moment, bringing with them concepts that hadn't existed before. Time, cycles, change. Only the third box remained, the one containing the stars. This one was different from the others, its surface sparkling with thousands of tiny points of light, as if it could no longer contain the energy it held inside. The seal on this last box was the most complex of the three, an intricate web of energy that seemed to change shape every time Kokoro looked at it. Namaka noticed Raven's hesitation at this latest challenge. "The stars are different," she warned, their waters reflecting the combined brilliance of the sun and moon. "They carry not only light, but also dreams and destinies. They are the weavers of stories yet to come." Kokoro understood that this last release would be the most significant. The stars would not just be points of light in the sky. They would be beacons of hope, guides for travelers, inspiration for the dreamers who would one day inhabit the world he was creating. With a delicacy that contrasted with his imposing form, the raven began to work on the last seal. His wings moved with surgical precision, undoing the mystical knots one by one. The process was slow and required all his concentration, as one false move could result in cosmic chaos. As the seal came undone, tiny points of light began to escape, like little sighs of eternity. Each star that broke free found its place in the vast night sky, gradually forming the constellations that would tell the stories of the universe. Kokoro's work was almost complete, but he knew that this was only the beginning of his journey as a creator. Light had been brought into the world, but there was still much to be done. The infinite waters begged for land, the vast empty expanses cried out for life, and the primordial silence longed for voices to fill it. The last star found its place in the firmament, completing the great work of illuminating the world. Kokoro hovered for a moment, his wings outstretched, admiring the transformation he had accomplished. The universe now pulsed with a new and vibrant energy, a rhythm that he himself had established. Namaka moved his waters in a pattern that suggested approval. "You have brought light into the world, architect," she said, her voice carrying a new tone of respect. "But the darkness still has its place in its purpose. The balance you have created is perfect." Raven knew she was right. The darkness had not been eliminated, but transformed into something just as precious. The night, with its silver moon and twinkling stars, was just as important as the sunny day. It was in this balance that the true beauty of his creation lay. While resting on a gentle wave, Kokoro was already beginning to plan his next great work. His keen eyes focused on the depths of the ocean, where he knew he would find the necessary elements for his next creation. The mainland was waiting to emerge, and with it, a new chapter in the history of the world was about to begin. With his gaze fixed on the depths of the ocean, Kokoro began his descent into the dark waters. Her wings, still shimmering with the reflection of the celestial lights she had released, cut through the air in precise movements. The world was different now, no longer plunged in perpetual darkness, but in a harmonious cycle of light and shadow. Namaka sensed the approach of the raven, and its waters opened gently, like a silent invitation. "The depths hold ancient secrets," she whispered across the waves. "What do you seek in the bowels of the ocean, creator?" Kokoro dipped her wings into the warm waters, feeling the primal energy that pulsed in the underwater currents. "I seek the substance from which the earth will be born," he replied, his voice reverberating through the waters. "This world needs more than just sky and sea." The raven's dive was deep and determined. As he descended, the waters became denser and colder. The light he had brought to the world barely penetrated these depths, creating a realm of shadows reminiscent of the beginning of time. But now, these shadows were no longer an endless void. They were a mystery to be explored. At the bottom of the ocean, Kokoro found what he was looking for: a dense, dark mass, a mixture of sand, rocks, and minerals that had lain dormant since the beginning of time. With his powerful beak, he began to work this primordial matter, shaping it with the same precision he had used to release the celestial lights. Namaka watched with growing interest as the raven worked. Its waters danced around him, sometimes helping, sometimes testing his resolve with unexpected currents. "The land you seek to create will forever change the face of the world," she commented. "My waters will have to learn new ways." The work was hard, but Kokoro didn't give up. Little by little, he began to push the mass up towards the surface. As it rose, the matter began to transform, hardening and taking shape under the influence of air and light. First a rocky peak emerged, then another and another. The sun, on its first full pass through the sky, witnessed the birth of the first mountains. Their dark slopes rose from the waters like sleeping giants, dripping primordial water back into the ocean. The moon, in its first cycle, bathed the new lands in its silvery light, revealing valleys and plains that formed between the peaks. But Kokoro knew that bare earth wasn't enough. With his wings, he began to spread different types of soil over the basic rock. Here a layer of fertile earth, there a bed of clay, further on a field of sand. Each type of soil had its purpose in the grand plan that was developing in his creative mind. The stars, watching from above, seemed to twinkle with approval as the world below them gained more complexity and texture. Their reflections in Namaka's waters created patterns that inspired Kokoro to continue his creative work. "I see the purpose in your work," said Namaka, his waves now crashing against the new rocky shores. "But I also see that this is only the beginning. The land you raise from my depths is still bare and empty." Raven landed on the highest peak of the first mountain he had created. From this privileged vantage point, he could see his creation stretching out in all directions. The lands that emerged from the waters formed complex patterns: archipelagos, peninsulas, deep valleys, and vast plains. With a flick of his wings, Kokoro began to create rivers and lakes, natural channels where the waters of Namaka could flow and settle over the new land. These waterways would be the veins of the world, bringing life and nutrients to every corner of his creation. "Every drop that flows over your land carries a promise," observed Namaka, feeling its waters divide and find new paths across the newborn continent. "I see the potential for life in every stream and lake you create." Namaka's words touched something deep in Raven's heart. Yes, life, this would be his next great challenge. But before he could take this step, he needed to prepare the ground properly. With meticulous care, he began to work on the texture of the earth, creating different environments that would one day house different forms of life. Using his powers of creation, he shaped caves in the bowels of the mountains, carved fertile valleys between the elevations, and created plains that stretched to the horizon. Each environment had its own personality, its own story to tell. The sun completed another cycle, and the moon once again bathed the new land in its silvery light. The stars continued their eternal dance in the sky, silent witnesses to Raven's tireless work. Every moment, the world took on more detail, more complexity. Kokoro knew that his work with the earth was almost complete, but something was still missing. The rocky surfaces and bare soil cried out for cover, for color, for life. His keen eye could already see the forests that would grow on the mountain slopes, the fields that would flourish on the plains, the algae that would dance in the shallows. With his wings spread, capturing the combined energy of the sun and the moon, the raven was preparing for his next great work. The creation of plant life would be his next challenge, and he could already feel the creative energy flowing through his feathers. Eager to begin this new phase of his creative journey, Namaka, sensing Kokoro's thoughts, moved his waters in a pattern that suggested expectation. "You have shaped the earth wisely," she said, her waves gently caressing the new shores. "Now it's time to cover it with the green mantle of life." Raven nodded silently, his eyes shining with the reflection of the stars. The stage was set for the next act of creation, and he couldn't wait to start painting his world with the colors of life. With his unwavering determination, Kokoro began his next act of creation. Hovering over the newly formed earth, he could feel the life energy pulsing through his black feathers. The bare soil was eagerly awaiting the touch that would transform it into a verdant paradise. First, Raven focused his attention on the banks where land and water met. With delicate movements of his wings, he scattered the first seeds of life, small algae and mosses that quickly established themselves on the damp rocks. These first life forms were simple, but fundamental to what was to come. "I see you start at the beginning," observed Namaka, his waters gently nurturing the new green creatures. "As always, your wisdom shows in the details." Kokoro continued his methodical work, gradually moving from the banks to the interior. In each different type of soil he had created, he now planted a specific variety of plant life. On the rocky slopes, he planted resistant lichens and small plants that clung to the rocks with fierce determination. As his work progressed, the plants began to evolve and diversify of their own accord, as if they had captured Raven's creative essence. Small shoots grew into bushes, which in turn inspired the birth of ever larger trees. The first forests began to appear on the slopes of the mountains, with a mixture of sun, rain, and fertile soil created the perfect conditions for growth. Kokoro watched with satisfaction as different species of trees established themselves, some tall and majestic, others twisted and ancient in their wisdom. Each plant has its own spirit, he murmured, landing briefly on a newly formed bridge. Each one tells its own story. On the plains, ravens sowed vast fields of grasses that rippled in the wind like the waters of Namaka. The prairies stretched to the horizon, their colors changing with the passing of the sun and moon. In some places, wildflowers began to sprout spontaneously, adding vibrant spots of color to the landscape. Namaka watched in amazement as her aquatic world was complemented by this explosion of terrestrial life. Her waters now not only reflected the lights in the sky, but also the infinite shades of green that Kokoro had brought into being. In the wettest areas where fresh water accumulated in swamps and marshes, Corvo created specially adapted plants, tall reeds, sturdy cattails, and delicate aquatic plants that floated on the surface of the calm waters. Each environment had its own signature plant, perfectly adapted to the local conditions. As the plants became established, the first natural cycles began to emerge. Leaves fell and decomposed, further enriching the soil. Seeds were carried by the wind, finding new places to germinate. The earth itself seemed to breathe with this new life. "You've created more than plants," said Namaka, observing the complex systems that were forming. "You've created communities, you've created relationships. You've created a living fabric that connects everything." Raven silently agreed. He could feel the connections forming between the roots in the soil, between the treetops above, between the different species that now shared the space. It was a web of life that was becoming more complex by the moment. In special places, Kokoro created natural sanctuaries of extraordinary beauty, hidden valleys where rare flowers bloomed in cascades of color, ancient forests where gigantic trees stood like pillars of heaven, natural gardens where every plant seemed to have been placed with artistic precision. The work continued tirelessly. In the driest regions, Corvo created resistant plants that knew how to conserve water, peculiarly shaped cacti, thorny shrubs, and small succulents that sparkled like jewels in the desert sun. Each adaptation was a new expression of their creativity. In the higher mountains, where the air was thinner and the cold more intense, he established a specially hardy vegetation, small alpine flowers that burst into vibrant color during the brief growing seasons, and low, twisted trees that survive the strongest winds. As the green blanket spread across the world, Kokoro realized that he was creating more than just plants. He was laying the foundations for all life to come. The forests, prairies, and swamps would be the cradle of the future creatures that would inhabit his world. The stage is almost set, he thought, his black wings reflecting the shades of green that now dominated the landscape. Just one last touch to go before we can welcome the next inhabitants of this world. With that thought, Raven set to work on his next challenge, creating plants that could provide sustenance for the creatures to come. Fruit trees began to appear in sheltered valleys, their tops laden with juicy fruit. Nutritious grains grew in the fields, and energy-rich roots established themselves in the fertile soil. Namaka, ever observant, noticed how each new addition to the plant world seemed to follow a larger plan. "You think of those that come after," she commented, her waters nourishing the roots of the plants that reach their depths. "Every seed you plant carries the potential to sustain many lives." The sun and moon continued their eternal dance across the sky, marking the passage of time as the world below transformed into a living, pulsating garden. The stars twinkled above the treetops, their reflections now multiplied in the dewy leaves and night flowers that opened only under their silvery light. Kokoro knew that his work with the plant kingdom was almost complete, but he also felt that something even greater awaited him. The plants had brought color and life to the world, but there was still a lack of movement, a lack of voices, a lack of creatures who could appreciate and inhabit this paradise he had created. With his wings open to the wind, Raven contemplated his next great challenge, to bring into being the beings that would give life and movement to this green world. It would be his most complex and important creation yet, and he couldn't wait to get started. Kokoro flew over his verdant world, admiring the symphony of life he had created. The forests whispered ancient secrets, the prairies danced with the wind, and the waters of Namaka reflected the celestial ballet of the sun, moon, and stars. But Raven felt that his work was not yet complete. The final breath of life was missing, the creatures that would give voice and movement to this majestic scenery. Landing gently on an old bridge, Kokoro began to gather his creative energy. This time, her work would be more delicate and complex than ever. Creating living beings would require not only form and substance, but also spirit and purpose. The waters yearn for inhabitants, whispered Namaka, his waves gently lapping the verdant shores. I feel the emptiness in the depths that only life can fill. The raven nodded and, with a graceful movement of its wings, began its work in the waters. First came the fish, small and bright, cutting through the waves and silvery shores. Then larger creatures emerged from the depths, playful dolphins, majestic whales, and a myriad of sea creatures that filled Namaka's oceans with movement and purpose. But Kokoro didn't just stop at the waters. Turning his attention to dry land, he began to populate the forests and grasslands. From the smallest insects to the most imposing mammals, each creature was carefully thought out to occupy its specific place in the great fabric of life. Birds were his most special creations. As he himself had wings, he paid extra attention to his winged cousins. Delicate hummingbirds, majestic eagles, wise owls. Each was given a unique gift, a special way to contribute to the harmony of the world. You create not just bodies, but stories, observed Namaka, watching as each creature integrated perfectly into its surroundings. The butterflies danced among the flowers she had seen Kokoro plant, the deer grazed on the prairies he had sown, and the bears found shelter in the caves he had carved. As the creatures multiplied, they began to establish their own relationships and cycles. Predator and prey, pollinator and flower, each being found its role in the great dance of life. The once silent world now pulsed with roars, chants, hums, and calls. Kokoro flew from one habitat to another, adjusting and refining his creation. In the mountains, agile goats and majestic eagles made the heights their home. In the swamps, frogs and herons created a natural orchestra of sounds. In the grasslands, herds of herbivores grazed peacefully under the watchful eye of predators. Each creature carries a spark of your creative essence, said Namaka, observing how life spread and adapted. I see your wisdom in the way each one finds its place. Raven continued his work, now focusing on the smallest details. He created insects to pollinate flowers and aerate the soil, small rodents to spread seeds, and a myriad of microscopic creatures to maintain the balance of ecosystems. The seasons began to influence animal behavior. Some migrated as the weather changed, others hibernated during colder periods, and still others adapted their appearance and behavior to suit the different times of year. You have created more than life, observed Namaka. You have created stories that will unfold for generations. And so was, each creature had its own role in the world's grand narrative. The songbirds heralded the dawn, the wolves howled at the moon that Kokoro had released, and the whales sang ancient melodies in the depths of Namaka. The raven landed again on the highest peak, observing his creation in all its glory. The world was now a vibrant and dynamic place, where each being lived in harmony with the others and their environment. It is done, he finally said, his words echoing through time. The world is complete. Namaka moved his waters in a pattern of agreement. Yes, it is complete but never finished. What you have created will continue to grow, change, and adapt. Each creature carries within it the potential for evolution and transformation. And so, Kokoro, the raven creator, completed his great work. The world that had once been just darkness and water now pulsed with life in all its forms. The celestial lights he had unleashed illuminated a planet rich in diversity and beauty. But even though he had completed his task, Raven knew that his role was not over. Now he would be the guardian, the observer, the one who would watch over the delicate balance he had established. The stars continued their eternal dance in the sky. The sun and moon kept up their perpetual dance, and the waters of Namaka embraced the earth with their ancient wisdom. And in the midst of all this, Kokoro flew, his black wings reflecting the light that he himself had brought to the world, eternal guardian of the creation that had been born from his power and his imagination. The world was complete, but its story had only just begun. Every sunrise would bring new adventures, every moonset would hold new mysteries, and every shining star would bear witness to the infinite stories that were yet to come in the world Raven had created. It was a warm summer afternoon, and Alice was sitting under a large tree in the garden of her house, struggling to keep her eyes open while her older sister read aloud from a boring storybook. The golden sun filtered lazily through the leaves, creating dancing patterns on Alice's blue dress, and she sighed repeatedly, wishing the book had at least a few illustrations to make it more interesting to read. "What's the use of a book without pictures?" she muttered to herself, absent-mindedly playing with the daisies growing around her. Then something extraordinary happened, something that would change her life forever. A white rabbit, wearing an elegant vest and carrying a pocket watch, ran past her. The most surprising thing was not his peculiar outfit, but the fact that he was anxiously checking his watch, repeating aloud, "Ouch, ouch, I'm going to be late, very late." Alice blinked several times, wondering if the heat of the day was affecting her mind. Rabbits didn't wear vests, let alone carry watches or talk about appointments. But before she could fully process what she was seeing, her natural curiosity took over, and she found herself running after the curious animal. The rabbit disappeared behind a bush, and Alice followed it without hesitation. To her surprise, she discovered a huge rabbit hole under a bush. It was bigger than any burrow she had ever seen, and something about it seemed inviting, almost magical. Without a second thought, Alice bent down to look inside. The ground beneath her knees suddenly gave way, and she found herself falling into a deep, dark hole. The fall seemed endless, but strangely it wasn't frightening. The walls of the tunnel were full of shelves, maps, pictures, and curious objects. She floated past a bookcase full of jam jars, an ornate mirror, and even a cat sleeping in a velvet armchair. As she fell, Alice began to question her own sanity. Am I dreaming? But I've never had a dream this vivid. What if I'm going mad? But do mad people know they're mad? I don't think so. Her thoughts were interrupted when she landed softly in a pile of dry leaves. Recovering from her fall, Alice found herself in a long, low corridor, lit by a series of lamps that hung from the ceiling. The white rabbit was still in sight, running hurriedly around a corner. Alice followed him, determined to find out where he was going in such a hurry. The corridor led to a circular room with several doors of different sizes. In the center was a glass table with a small golden key on it. Alice tried the key in all the doors, but none would open, except the smallest one, which was so small it could barely fit a mouse. Returning to the table, she found a bottle that hadn't been there before. The label read "Drink Me" in elegant letters. Well, if it makes me grow smaller, I can get through the little door, Alice reasoned. And if it makes me grow bigger, I can reach the key that's too high. One way or another, something interesting is going to happen. She drank the contents of the bottle, which had a curious taste, a mixture of cherry pie, custard, pineapple, roast turkey, and hot caramel. Immediately, she began to shrink down to the perfect size to pass through the small door. However, she realized that she had left the golden key on the table, now unreachable due to its diminutive size. Frustrated, Alice noticed a small cake with the words "Eat me" written on it in raisins. Well, I'll eat it, she decided. If it makes me bigger, I can reach the key, and if it makes me smaller, I can crawl under the door. The result was more dramatic than she expected. It grew so big that its head hit the living room ceiling. Curiouser and curiouser, exclaimed Alice, surprised to realize that she was making up words. Her tears of frustration were now the size of a bathtub, and soon the room began to fill with water. In the midst of her dilemma, the white rabbit passed by again, even more hurriedly, dropping his white gloves and fan. Alice picked them up and, shaking herself with the fan, realized that she was shrieking again. Soon she was swimming in a sea of her own tears, along with several other creatures that had been swept away by the current. Among the creatures was a very dignified mouse, who seemed rather irritated by the whole situation. "Mr. Mouse," Alice began politely, "can you tell me how to get out of here?" The rat just looked at her with disdain and started swimming away, followed by a duck, a dodo, and several other strange creatures. Alice followed the group to the shore, where they all gathered, soaking wet and grumpy. The dodo suggested a racing committee to dry off, in which everyone ran around in circles without a defined finishing point. Alice found it all very confusing, but took part nonetheless, realizing that in this strange place, logic seemed to work differently. As she ran with the creatures, Alice began to understand that she had entered a world where the normal rules didn't apply. A world where rabbits wore watches, rats were dignified enough to be offended, and races didn't have to have winners. It was a world that defied everything she knew and yet somehow made its own kind of sense. The sun was beginning to set in this strange place, painting the sky in colors Alice had never seen before. The shadows lengthened in impossible ways, and she could swear that some of them winked at her. The white rabbit had disappeared again, but now Alice was determined to explore this wonderful world, no matter how strange or frightening it might seem. As Alice familiarized herself with this peculiar new world, the white rabbit reappeared in the distance, still frantically checking his watch. Without hesitation, she said goodbye to the drenched creatures and followed the hurrying animal along a winding path that meandered through impossibly colored trees. "Please wait," called Alice. But the rabbit only muttered something about the Duchess being furious and disappeared behind a bend. Turning the corner, Alice came across a charming, albeit somewhat crooked, house with chimneys that spewed smoke in the shape of letters of the alphabet. Approaching the door, she noticed that it was once again the wrong size, this time too big to pass through. Luckily, she found another jar labeled "Drink Me" in the garden. After her previous experience, Alice was more cautious, taking only a small sip. To her relief, it shrank to the ideal size. Inside the house, she found a chaotic scene. A duchess cradling a baby who cried nonstop, while a cook poured almost the entire pot of pepper into a steaming soup. The air was so charged with pepper that everyone was sneezing constantly. "Why so much spice?" asked Alice between sneezes. "Because it is," replied the cook harshly, throwing a pot in the direction of the duchess, who was still nursing her baby with a nonsensical song about bats and tea. In the midst of the confusion, Alice noticed a smile floating in the air. Gradually, a striped cat materialized around the smile. It was the famous Cheshire Cat, about whom she would soon hear much more. Its bright eyes watched her with a mixture of amusement and wisdom. "Where should I go?" Alice asked the cat, hoping for a straight answer in the midst of so much chaos. "That depends a lot on where you want to go," replied the cat, his smile widening impossibly. "It doesn't really matter, as long as I get somewhere," said Alice. "Oh, then you'll certainly get somewhere," assured the cat, "if you walk long enough." While they were talking, the Duchess suddenly threw the baby into Alice's arms and hurried off, muttering something about a game of croquet with the Queen. Alice looked at the baby and, to her surprise, it began to turn into a little pig, which soon escaped into the garden. "Does it happen often around here?" Alice asked the cat. "What? Babies turning into little pigs?" The cat laughed. "More than you might think. By the way, if you want a really interesting afternoon, I suggest you visit the Mad Hatter. He's having a tea party just over there." The cat pointed with his paw to a path that Alice was sure hadn't been their seconds before. Before she could fake him, the feline began to gradually disappear, from tail to head, leaving only his characteristic floating smile. Following the cat's suggestion, Alice walked along the new path, which seemed to change direction when she wasn't looking. The trees whispered incomprehensible conversations among themselves, and flowers of impossible colors turned their petals to watch her pass. Soon, she began to hear the sounds of laughter and the clinking of teacups. As she approached, she saw a long table set up for tea in the garden, laden with teapots, cups, cakes, and other delicacies. The Mad Hatter was presiding over the table, wearing an extraordinarily tall hat, accompanied by a March hare and a caxing whale who seemed to be sleeping in a teacup. "There's no room. There's no room," they shouted when Alice approached. "There are plenty of seats," she replied, taking a seat in a large armchair at the head of the table. "Would you like some wine?" offered the Mad Hatter. "I don't see any wine," said Alice, looking around the table. "There isn't any," replied the March hare. "Then it wasn't very polite to offer it," said Alice angrily. "It wasn't very polite to sit down uninvited," retorted the hare. "I didn't know it was your table," said Alice. "It's set for much more than 3 people." "Your hair needs a cut," said the Hatter, abruptly changing the subject and watching Alice with great interest. "You should learn not to make personal comments," Alice replied sternly. "It's very rude." The Hatter's eyes widened. "Why does a crow look like a desk?" Before Alice could answer this impossible riddle, Caxingle woke up briefly to mutter something about melted butter and went back to sleep, dipping his nose into his cup of tea. The Hatter and the hare started trying to stuff the little animal into a teapot, claiming he needed a bath. Alice watched everything with a mixture of fascination and confusion. Every time she tried to make sense of the situation, something even more absurd happened. The tea was served at random times, the story started in the middle, and the jokes weren't funny, or maybe they were so funny that she couldn't understand them. "What time is it?" asked the Hatter, nervously shaking his watch. "It's 6 o'clock," replied Alice. "2 days late," exclaimed the Hatter. "I told you butter wouldn't be good for the mechanism." "It was the best butter," added the hare sadly. Alice was beginning to realize that time and logic worked completely differently in this place. The Hatter's clock marked the day of the month, not the hour, and apparently it was always 6 o'clock perpetual tea time. As the tea party continued in its endless cycle, Alice realized that she would get nowhere if she stayed there. Politely, she got up from the table, leaving the Mad Hatter and the March hare to discuss whether time could be churned like butter. "Time is very sensitive," explained the Hatter as Alice walked away. "Ever since we fought, it has stopped at 6 o'clock for us. Always tea time." Following a new path through the forest, Alice came across a tree with a door in its trunk. Curiously, there were several signs pointing in different directions, all indicating through here and through there, but none of them seemed to make sense. That's when the Cheshire Cat smile appeared again, followed by the rest of him. "How's your adventure going?" asked the cat, spinning upside down in the air. "It's all very confusing," replied Alice. "The people here are quite rude, and nothing seems to make sense." "Oh, but it makes sense," replied the cat. "Just not the kind of sense you're used to. By the way, the Queen is having a game of croquet. You should go. Everyone should go, or they'll lose their heads." Before Alice could protest, the cat began to disappear again, this time starting with its head and ending with its smile, which she found particularly disturbing. Following the enigmatic feline's directions, Alice soon arrived at a beautiful garden. Gardeners in the shape of playing cards were busy painting white roses red, working frantically and spilling paint everywhere. "Why are you painting these roses?" asked Alice, curious. "Well," replied the Five of Wands, looking nervously over his shoulder, "we planted white roses by mistake, and the Queen of Hearts hates white roses. If she finds out, she'll have our heads cut off." No sooner had he finished speaking than trumpets sounded announcing the arrival of the royal court. The Queen of Hearts was an imposing and frightening figure, with a face red with anger and a crown that seemed too big for her head. The king walked a few steps behind, looking worried and much smaller than his wife. "Who painted my roses?" shouted the queen when she saw the paint dripping from the flowers. "Cut off their heads." The poor gardeners threw themselves to the ground, begging for mercy, but the queen had already lost interest in them, having noticed Alice. "And who are you?" asked the monarch, her small, bright eyes fixed on the girl. "I'm Alice, your majesty," she replied, bowing as her sister had taught her. "Do you know how to play croquet?" asked the queen. "Yes," replied Alice, although she suspected that croquet in this place would be very different from what she knew. She was right. The bats were live flamingos that insisted on turning their necks at the wrong moment. The balls were hedgehogs that often decided to roll off on their own. And the hoops were made up of the card soldiers who wouldn't stand still in their positions. The queen played with frightening violets, brandishing her flamingo like a weapon and shouting, "Cut his head, OFF," at anyone who dared to beat her, which nobody did, of course. The king followed her, silently forgiving everyone she condemned. During the game, Alice noticed that the Cheshire Cat appeared and disappeared among the guests, causing even more confusion. The queen, who apparently didn't like cats, became increasingly furious at his appearances. "If that cat doesn't stop teasing me, cut his head, OFF," shouted the queen. "But he doesn't have a body at the moment, Your Majesty," remarked Alice. "How can you cut off the head of someone who only has a head?" This logical question left the queen momentarily speechless, her face turning even redder. The king took the opportunity to suggest a tea break, which fortunately distracted his wife from the question of the impossible decapitation. During tea, served at a gigantic table in the garden, Alice found herself sitting between the White Rabbit, who was still nervously checking his watch, and the Duchess, who had been released from prison especially for the event. "The moral of all this," began the Duchess, "is that love makes the world go round." "Someone said it's pride that does that," commented Alice, trying to remember something she had read. "Whatever," said the Duchess. "It can be both, as long as you find a moral in everything." The banquet was a surreal sight. Pies that sang when cut, puddings that changed color, and cookies that made people grow or shrink at random. Alice ate very carefully, fearing that she would change size in the middle of the real dinner. The conversation at the table was just as strange. The queen was arguing with the griffin about the best way to perform a dance, while the false turtle was crying into his soup, remembering his school days at the bottom of the sea. The Mad Hatter had snuck into the party and was now trying to fix the White Rabbit's clock using butter and cake crumbs. "Is all this a dream?" Alice wondered aloud, observing the chaos around her. "If it's a dream, whose is it?" replied the Cheshire Cat, materializing in an empty chair. "Yours? Mine? The Queen's? Maybe we're all part of someone's dream." Before Alice could ponder this philosophical question, the Queen announced that it was time for the trial. Although no one knew exactly what crime would be tried or who would be accused. "Everyone in accord," ordered the Queen. "And remember, sentence first, verdict later." Alice sighed, realizing that she was about to witness yet another demonstration of the inverted logic of Wonderland. As she followed the royal procession towards the courthouse, she couldn't help but think how her tedious afternoon of studying had turned into such an extraordinary adventure. The royal court was an even more chaotic scene than the croquet match. Jurors of all shapes and sizes, from small lizards to large birds, settled into their seats, while the king and queen sat on elevated thrones. The White Rabbit, now the royal herald, blew his trumpet nervously. "Silence in the court," announced the rabbit, unrolling a scroll. Today's case, the theft of the queen's strawberry tarts. Alice watched as they brought in the accused, the Jack of Hearts, who looked more confused than guilty. The king adjusted his crown and began to read out the charges, although his voice could barely be heard over the noise of the jurors taking notes on their slates. "As a witness," called out the rabbit, "we summon the Mad Hatter." The Hatter entered holding a cup of tea, still trembling. The Queen looked at him sternly. "Take off your hat." "I can't," replied the Hatter. "It's not mine." "Stealed," cried the Queen. "No, Your Majesty," he explained. "I sell them. I'm a Hatter." The confusion increased when the Hatter began to tell a completely unrelated story about his last tea with the March Hare. The Queen turned redder and redder, while the King frantically jotted down in his little notebook, "Don't mention tea again, too provocative." Alice, who had grown a little during the proceedings, probably due to a cookie she had absent-mindedly eaten, began to realize the absurdity of that trial. No one had really proved that the pies were stolen, or even that they existed. The next to testify was the Duchess's cook, who only talked about pepper and turtle soup, causing a series of collective sneezes in the courtroom. The Cheshire Cat appeared and disappeared among the jurors, making ironic comments that made the Queen even angrier. "Order! Order in the court!" shouted the king, banging his gavel which, for some reason, was made of jelly. The confusion reached its peak when they called the next witness a talking pie. How can a pie testify? Wondered Alice aloud, momentarily forgetting where she was. How can a girl who changes size question the logic of a talking pie? Replied the Cheshire Cat, appearing next to her. The tart began her testimony by singing a song about cherries and cream, which somehow turned into a story about a bat drinking tea with an umbrella. The judges were frantically taking notes, although Alice doubted that any of them understood what was going on. "Proof," shouted the Queen. "Present the evidence." The White Rabbit brought out an empty envelope. "This is the most conclusive proof we've ever had," he declared solemnly. "How can an empty envelope be proof?" asked Alice, again forgetting to keep quiet. "If there was something inside," explained the King patiently, "it wouldn't be proof of the theft because the pies would have been found. The fact that there is nothing is proof that they were stolen." Alice tried to process this tortuous logic as the trial continued. The dodo was called to testify and insisted on holding a race in committee inside the courtroom to demonstrate his point of view, whatever it was. The situation became even more confusing when the Duchess appeared with her baby pig, who started squealing so loudly that no one could hear her. The Hatter took advantage of the confusion to serve tea to all the jurors, who began to float due to some strange ingredient in the drink. "Order, order," shouted the King, now using his jelly hammer to try to reach the floating jurors. "To hell with order," declared the Queen. "Cut off their heads. All of them." It was at this point that Alice, who had grown even bigger during the chaos, decided she'd had enough. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed, her voice echoing through the courtroom. "You're just a deck of cards." A deathly silence fell over the court. The Queen, whose face was now purple with rage, pointed a trembling finger at Alice. "Cut her head off." The cards began to fly towards her, spinning in the air like leaves in a storm. Alice, now the size of a house, tried to push them away with her hands, but they kept coming, buzzing around her like a swarm of angry wasps. "You're nothing but a deck of cards," she repeated, her voice stronger this time, as the cards continued their frenzied attack. The White Rabbit blew his trumpet in panic, the Hatter hid inside his teacup, and the Cheshire Cat watched everything with his eternal enigmatic smile. The confusion grew by the second, with the cards flying higher and higher, the Queen shouting impossible orders, and the King desperately trying to restore order with his now melting jelly hammer. Alice felt she was losing control of the situation, but something inside her told her that this nonsense had to end. Amidst the growing chaos of the courtroom, Alice felt a strange sense of clarity. The cards continued to fly around her, but their movements seemed slower and slower, as if they were moving through honey. The Cheshire Cat's smile hung in the air like a crescent moon, and his words echoed in Alice's mind. "We're all mad here. This has to stop," thought Alice, and the moment this thought formed, the world around her began to ripple like the surface of a disturbed lake. The colors of Wonderland began to blend together like a wet watercolor. The furious red of the Queen, the vibrant green of the garden, the deep blue of the impossible sky. The Queen was still shouting orders, but her voice sounded distant now, as if it came from inside a very long tunnel. The Mad Hatter emerged from his teacup only to start a new story about why a crow looks like a desk, while the March Hare clapped enthusiastically, throwing cookies everywhere. "But it doesn't make sense," protested Alice, watching the cookies turn into butterflies before they hit the ground. "Of course it makes sense," replied the Cheshire Cat, fully materializing for the first time. "You're just trying to find sense where nonsense reigns. Sometimes, dear Alice, the only sensible thing to do is to embrace the madness." The cat's words made Alice reflect on her entire journey. From the moment she followed the White Rabbit, she had tried to apply the logic of her world to this extraordinary place. Now she realized that perhaps true wisdom lay in accepting that not everything had to make sense. The courtroom had turned into a veritable carnival of absurdities. The floating jurors began to sing in harmony with the tart witness, while the King tried to maintain order using his jelly gave Lynn as a baton. The Duchess danced a waltz with her baby pig, who now wore a powdered wig and recited poetry in Latin. "You're all mad," declared Alice, but this time there was a smile in her voice. "Ah, now you understand," exclaimed the Mad Hatter, pouring tea in cups that floated through the air. "We're all mad here. Even you, my dear. After all, what sane person would follow a dressed-up rabbit?" Alice couldn't help but laugh. It was true. She had chosen to follow the white rabbit. She had chosen to drink from mysterious bottles and eat magical cakes. Every decision she made led her deeper into this wonderful, absurd world. The cards that were still flying around her began to turn into flowers, their sharp edges softening into delicate petals. The Queen of Hearts, seeing her authority literally blossom, was so surprised that her crown slipped and started spinning like a top. "Impossible," cried the Queen. "Nothing is impossible," replied Alice serenely. "Only improbable." The white rabbit, still checking his watch, began to shrink in size until he was just a small white dot on the horizon. The clock in his paws turned into a soap bubble that floated upwards, taking with it all the worries about being late. The false tortoise and the griffin began an elaborate dance, dragging other characters into their chaotic choreography. Soon, the whole court was involved in a surreal quadrille, with the dodo calling out the steps in a language no one understood, but everyone seemed to know exactly what to do. "See," said the Cheshire Cat, now dancing upside down in the air. "When you stop trying to make sense of things, they start to make sense by themselves." Alice watched in amazement as Wonderland began to dissolve around her, not in a frightening way, but like a dream gently coming to an end. The colors began to soften, the sounds became more distant, and she felt a deep peace come over her. "It's time to wake up," whispered the cat, his smile being the last thing to disappear. Alice opened her eyes slowly, finding herself once again under the tree where it had all begun. Her sister was still there, the storybook on her lap, looking at her curiously. "You slept for a long time," said her sister. "You must have had some interesting dreams." Alice smiled, sitting up and fixing her blue dress. The daisies were still dancing in the afternoon breeze, and in the distance, she could have sworn she saw a white rabbit scurrying among the flowers. "You know," said Alice thoughtfully, "I think I've learned something important today." "And what would that be?" asked her sister. "That sometimes the most senseless things make the most sense of all," replied Alice. "And that there's nothing wrong with being a little crazy once in a while." Her sister laughed, closing the history book. "You say the strangest things sometimes, Alice." "Yes," agreed Alice, smiling as she watched a butterfly that seemed to be winking at her. "And isn't it wonderful?" The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with colors vaguely reminiscent of Wonderland. Alice stood up, shaking the leaves from her dress, ready to go home. But she knew that a part of her would always remain in that extraordinary world where rabbits wear watches, cats can disappear, and a cup of tea is always an adventure waiting to happen. And so ended Alice's adventure in Wonderland. But as the Cheshire Cat might say, no story ever really ends. It just continues in a different way, somewhere else, waiting to be discovered again.